Eastern salutation, though a beautiful one. When we say, goodbye, which means, God be with you, it is the same thing, for God is peace. The salam of the Mohammedans is again the same as salam in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem means the abode of peace. The Hindus have the word shanti, which means peace, and their namaste, which means greetings, or reverence, to thee, is generally answered by the word shanti. 581. It is customary to write, peace be with you, at the end of books in the East as a kind of final greeting or leave-taking from the author to the reader. But, as the Master says here, my peace I give unto you, can only be said under special circumstances. When Christ said, peace I leave with you, my peace I give unto you, not as the world giveth, give I unto you, 1 John 15:27. He was speaking to his own special disciples only. It is said here that the disciple who can receive the peace of the Master is only that one who is as the Master himself, that is, an accepted pupil, perhaps even more, he who is the son of the Master. He receives not merely a good wish for peace and blessing, which would most certainly be an effective thing when pronounced by one who had the power to pronounce it, but more than that. The Master gives his own peace, the peace which nothing can disturb, to those who are as himself, who are his own sons, part of his own nature, sharing with him all that he is in so far as they are able to receive it. This does not mean, of course, that the pupil is able to share all that the Master is and has. To do that would mean that the pupil was himself an adept, but at least he shares as much as possible. 582. There are some even among those who are ignorant of the Eastern wisdom, to whom this can be said, and to whom it can daily be said with more completeness. 583. This is a very interesting and remarkable message, which may well seem strange to us, because there are a great many of us who do know something of the Eastern wisdom, who pay reverence to the great masters, who have for many years belonged to an organization specially devoted to them and their service, and yet to most of us the Master cannot say, my peace I give unto you. But only to those very few whom he has taken into a much closer relation to himself. That being so, we yet read that to some who do not know the Eastern wisdom at all this inner blessing can be given. 584. How is that, and who would they be to whom such a privilege is given? They would be few only, at the present stage of evolution, but still a few there undoubtedly are. In order to understand that, let us think what it is that enables a master to take a pupil as close to him as that. It is that the pupil has come into the Master's world, has learned to look at things as the Master looks at them, and to put himself into the Master's attitude towards the world and all that belongs to it. A man may do that without knowing anything about the Eastern wisdom or about the Master at all, he may yet without that knowledge be such a man as would take that high view. The special characteristic of the Master's attitude is that it is utterly unselfish, that the lower self does not come into it at all. He looks at everything from the standpoint of the plan of the deity, and he never for one moment brings his own personality into the matter. If anything is helpful for human evolution it is good. If it is a hindrance to human evolution it is an evil thing. Although the Eastern wisdom must bring us perfectly into that attitude if we understand it quite fully, yet we can see that others ignorant of it might also reach such an attitude. To be near enough to the Master to receive his peace, utter unselfishness is the first and greatest prerequisite. One may be near the Master, one may receive his peace even, and yet of two who stand beside him and receive it, one may receive it far more fully than the other. The ignorant though utterly saintly and unselfish person will receive from the peace of the Master all he can receive, but the man who, equal to him in this respect, possesses in addition the higher wisdom, will receive from that peace infinitely more. 585. Increment regard the three truths. They are equal. 586. This line is preceded by a triangle which is used as a kind of signature of him who wrote it, just as the cross is prefixed by Catholic bishops to their letters and documents. It is done here to attract special attention. 587. The three truths to which the Master Hilarion refers are those which he himself enunciated in another book which he dictated, The Idol of the White Lotus, which has not received quite the attention which it deserves. It is an account of a previous life of his own, which he spent in Egypt, and the great Egyptian religion was in its decadence and was no longer understood. Its splendid and impersonal worship had degenerated into the following of a goddess who demanded not so much perfect purity as perfect passion from her people, and so there was much corruption. 588. The master, whose name at that time was Sensa, was a clairvoyant pupil in an Egyptian temple. The priests of the temple recognized his value as a clairvoyant and as a medium, but did not wish him to teach true religion to the people, because that would have interfered with the existent ecclesiastical system, and eventually they killed him. In the course of the story, after going through many trials, he found himself surrounded by a group of adepts, among whom was his own master, who then told him what to teach to the people, to those who had been misled by wrong teaching. They told him to preach broad truths only. We have the form in which the three great truths were then given. They are prefaced by the words, "There are three truths which are absolute and cannot be lost, but yet may remain silent for lack of speech." That means they can never be lost because they are held by the great brotherhood, although they may not at a given time be known in the world because there is no one to speak them. 589. The first great truth is, the soul of man is immortal, and its future is the future of a thing whose growth and splendor have no limit. This great truth at once does away with all fear of Bel and of the necessity of salvation, because there is absolute certainty of final attainment for every human soul, no matter how far he may seem to have strayed from the path of evolution. 590. The second great truth is, the principle which gives life dwells in us, and without us, is undying and eternally beneficent, is not heard, or seen, or smelt, but is perceived by the man who desires perception. That means that the world is an expression of God, that man is part of him and can know it for himself when he is able to raise himself to the level at which it can be revealed to him. And that all things are definitely and intelligently moving together for good. 591. The third great truth is, each man is his own absolute lawgiver, the dispenser of glory or gloom to himself, the decreer of his life, his reward, his punishment. Here we have a clear statement of the law of karma, the law of readjustment, of balance. 592. Then follow the words, these truths, which are as great as is life itself, are as simple as the simplest mind of man. Feed the hungry with them. 593. Here we have a scheme of religion that can be taught to everyone. It consists of three main points of belief, simply formulated, yet very carefully expressed to guard against misunderstanding. They might briefly be stated thus: man is immortal, God is good, and, as a man sows so shall he reap. In this simpler form they are suitable for those who are at the stage where they must have simple dogma laid down for them. A more developed soul will want to understand it all. To him can be given the details, and there is enough in those details to occupy the minds of the wisest of men. 594. These three truths can be seen. They could be deduced from experience even if it were possible that they should be lost. Many egos know them. Some know them for themselves at first hand, but there are many others who at present, so far at least as their personalities are concerned, are only in the position of believing. They accept them because they are told they are true by those whom they trust, and because they seem to be self-evident, because they cannot otherwise in any reasonable way account for life as they see it. That is a stage, and a very useful stage, on the way to actual knowing, but of course it is not direct knowledge. I can say to you, for example, I know those truths are really so. Because on many planes and through many years I have made investigations and have carried out experiments which could not have resulted as they did unless these basic laws were true. So far only a few can say, I have seen, but all should work on towards that point, because actual knowledge gives one a far greater power than even the most definite intellectual conviction. 595. When a man is speaking of these facts, it is always evident whether he is speaking of that which he himself knows or only of that which he has heard. It makes a difference in the magnetic effect. Therefore, for the sake of others it is of importance that we should know something for ourselves as soon as possible. It may be but a very small part of the great truth, but if we know it by our own experience, that at once makes it more than probable that all the rest is also true, and gives us additional confidence. Those who have the perfect confidence born of knowledge can give help to others which cannot be given until one knows. It is that which makes our fragments of personal experience so useful. 596. There are many people who have at one time or other in vision, in sleep, or in meditation seen the Master. That is, perhaps, something which could not be proved to anyone else. People might say to a man who has had this experience, perhaps it was only an hallucination, or imagination, but he knows perfectly well that it was not anything of the kind. He knows that he did see, and that he also felt something which made him certain that this was one of our great masters. That is a piece of experience, small, yet far-reaching in its effects. Those who have been so fortunate as to have had such an experience as that may be deeply thankful. They know that much at least, and to know one fact belonging to the higher world at once makes all the rest of the teaching more luminous, and clearer to follow. So such experiences are not at all to be despised. 597. There is no harm in the fact that we do not know perfectly. It must be so, it is in the nature of things. It is when we suppose our knowledge to be complete, when it is pitifully incomplete, when we think that we know everything and condemn other men who think differently, not realizing that they may be seeing another side of a many-sided truth, that we go wrong. Let us by all means cling to our imperfect knowledge, but, while trying to increase it whenever we get an opportunity, let us never forget that it is imperfect. Lest we should be led into the mistake of condemning someone who perhaps knows more than we do. Truth is deep, truth is often mysterious. It cannot be grasped in its entirety by any one man nor by any one body or sect of men. We must gradually learn to appreciate truth, before we can know it in any of its aspects. The truth about anything is the way in which that thing presents itself to the Logos, to the Maker, of the whole system. He who made it alone understands all, knows all things as they are. His view is the only perfect view. For us truth is relative. We cannot see the whole as he sees it, but although our knowledge must be imperfect, at least it need not be wrong as far as it goes. We may have so much of the truth about a certain thing when we come to know all about it, when we reach adeptship, we shall not have to correct what we have previously known, but only to add to it. 598. It is a very difficult thing to know what one may teach people outside. It is good, therefore, to have this authoritative statement from a master, of certain things which may be taught generally. We often have to speak about theosophy to people who do not in the least take our point of view. In lecturing to the public one feels at times that it would help to make things clear if one revealed something of their inner meaning, and yet one hesitates lest one should do harm. 599. It is quite obvious that if we attempted to teach them all we know about theosophy, many people who heard would not understand a great deal of it. There are people to whom one feels at once that one could not speak of the masters, because the idea would be quite foreign to them. They would be likely to make some flippant or jeering remark with regard to it, and that would pain us and would bring exceedingly bad karma to them. The man who speaks evil of the great ones takes upon himself a very serious responsibility, and the fact that he does not believe in them has simply nothing to do with the result. We may not believe that a certain piece of metal is hot, but if we take hold of it we shall be burnt. People who speak evil of those who are devoting all their lives and strength to the helping of the world, are guilty of the great sin of ingratitude, as well as of that of making a mock of holy things, which is blasphemy. And the fact that they do not know that the things are holy does not come into the question at all. So we have to balance rather carefully what we say, because the only object in speaking at all is to do good to the person addressed. We may do him harm instead of good if we put before him something at which he will jeer or mock. 600. Remember the saying of the Christ, which is often not well understood, about casting pearls before swine. This is often taken quite wrongly as a comparison of the people to swine. That was surely not in the mind of the great master. He simply meant that to give the inner truths to people who have not yet the knowledge to enable them to appreciate them would be as foolish as to cast pearls before swine. They would probably rush forward expecting to receive something to eat, and finding that the pearls were not edible, they would trample them in the mire. And then turn and rend the giver of the pearls because they had been disappointed in their expectation of food. The pearls would be of no use to them, however valuable they might be to us. That is generally the attitude of ordinary people, when we put before them truths which are not comprehensible to them. They do not see their value. They cast them aside, and are usually angry with us for giving them something which they regard as useless. 601. It has always been recognized that only simple truths can be given to the great mass of men, who are as yet not highly evolved. All great religions have had some special truth which they strongly inculcated, and if any of these truths be taken in its entirety it will be found that it covers most of the ground. It is very necessary that certain ideas should be implanted in the minds of the evolving human egos, so they pass through religion after religion, race after race, learning something from each. 602. In Hinduism, for example, the great idea of duty was specially emphasized. It is obvious that when the thought of duty fills a man's mind it must lead to a good and carefully ordered life. The Greek religion was one which laid stress on beauty. The great cardinal fact that was impressed upon the Greek all through his life was that beauty was an expression of God. And that in so far as a man could make himself and his surroundings beautiful he brought them nearer to what the deity wished them to be, and thus allowed the divine power to manifest itself more fully through him. So even the smallest object in everyday life was always beautiful, not necessarily expensive, not difficult to get, but beautiful in shape and color. That was the fact which Greece impressed upon the world, the power of beauty. 603. In Christianity the central idea is devotion. The Christian Church has for centuries set before itself the idea of producing saints, holy men, good people, and it felicitates itself and rests its claim to attention upon the saints already produced. It celebrates their days, and in every way places them on the highest possible pinnacle. 604. Our examination of the history of these saints shows that among them were included individuals of many different types. Some of them were unquestionably great, learned and capable men. Others were not that at all, but were quite ordinary and ignorant, their great virtue being that they were good. Only when we come to study it deeply do we realize that the Christian religion is intended not only to feed the fire of devotion, but also to assist its people at all levels and along all lines. 605. When we examine other great religions, such as Buddhism or Hinduism, we find them also prepared to meet their people everywhere. Each of these religions has certain precepts for the uneducated, by virtue of which they will be helped, if they follow them truly, to lead a good life. It has also much metaphysical and philosophical teaching for those who need it. Christianity in its present form does not really give that. True, there are the writings of the Fathers, and if we go back to Origen and Clement of Alexandria we find hints of those higher teachings. We find, for example, the statement that Christianity has its mysteries. But the Christianity put before people by any of the great churches, such as the Greek, the Roman or the Anglican, is certainly a maimed representation of what it originally was. 606. Every true religion must be capable of adapting itself to people at all levels, of meeting the wise and learned, as well as the ignorant devotee. It certainly must not exalt the ignorant but devoted man above the wiser, who wants to understand. Unfortunately there has been a distinct tendency on the part of Christianity to condemn the people who have wanted to know, to disparage their wisdom as merely the wisdom of this world. And to regard those who take the attitude of a little child as likely to make more rapid progress. The child's soul must behave as such, and every religion must be prepared to meet and to feed the child's soul, but that is no reason why it should have no stronger food for those who are more advanced. The souls who have passed through the earlier stages of growth long ago in other lives now wish to understand the great plan, to know something about the world in which they live and the scheme by which it was made and is kept going. Many of our Christian brothers have found, with great relief and a certain amount of surprise, that Theosophy was capable of supplying them with that knowledge, without destroying their Christianity in any way. There is nothing in the original Christian teaching which in any way contradicts any science, although there has been an anti-scientific tendency coupled with ecclesiastical teaching ever since the Middle Ages. Originally Christianity answered its purpose quite as well as any of the other faiths. It is only because it happens to have been especially unfortunate in the loss of the higher teaching that it distinctly needs supplementing at the present day. 607, the Chohan then concludes Part 1 with the words. 608, these written above are the first of the rules which are written on the walls of the Hall of Learning. Those that ask shall have. Those that desire to read shall read. Those who desire to learn shall learn. Peace be with you. Part 2. Chapter 1. The Preliminary Comment. 609, CWL, the second part of Light on the Path assumes that the student has passed the first initiation. It carries the man on through the steps of the path leading up to the adept level. But a second and higher interpretation of it begins beyond that, and helps to guide the man who has already become an adept on to his next stage. Swarm T. Subaru, who knew a great deal about these matters, told me once that there were really 7 meanings for this book, 7 ways in which it could be interpreted, all apparently at different levels. And he said that the highest interpretations carried a man up to the initiation of the Mahakahan. That, of course, is dealing with matters which are absolutely beyond our ken. We could not possibly understand to what it refers at such a high level, so it is useless for us even to seek for such an interpretation. It is possible that we may be able to form some idea of a double meaning, but anything beyond that will certainly be quite out of our reach. 610. In what we have already studied we have been told to cast off the lower self, the personality. In the higher interpretation, that would mean casting off the individuality. Just as the first part in its lowest interpretation was thus intended to produce the union of the higher and lower self, so in its second interpretation it aims at the unity of the ego with the monad. That which is the second interpretation of the first part must be the first interpretation of the second part, since it follows from the first. It would be well for us to bear that in mind. Then here and there we may be able to catch a glimpse of what must be the meaning of the next interpretation higher still. 611, out of the silence that is peace a resonant voice shall arise. And this voice will say, it is not well. Thou hast reaped, now thou must sow, and knowing this voice to be the silence itself thou wilt obey. 612. Thou who art now a disciple, able to stand, able to hear, able to see, able to speak, who hast conquered desire and attained to self-knowledge, who hast seen thy soul in its bloom and recognized it, and heard the voice of the silence, go thou to the hall of learning and read what is written there for thee. 613, that is the introduction to this second part, written by the Venetian master. First of all, perhaps, one ought to refer to those opening words, out of the silence that is peace a resonant voice shall arise. And knowing this voice to be the silence itself thou wilt obey. There has been much speculation among theosophists as to the exact meaning of the voice of the silence, but it is now generally understood that the expression does not always mean the same thing. The silence is always that which lies just above the point which the man has reached, and the voice of the silence is the voice coming down to him from above, the voice of the inner self, as we have already seen. Point 11 ante, pages 62-3. 20. 614. In all cases this voice which speaks from above is that which when heard must be obeyed, and to the newly initiated man, if we take the lower interpretation, or to him who has attained adeptship, if we consider the higher interpretation. This voice says that while he is resting in the enjoyment of this wonderful peace, it is not well to rest too long. In the silence the man has remained in wonder at the glory of all he has received by initiation. He will rest in contemplation a while, he will spend some little time in studying everything in the new light that has come to him. He is now recalled by the voice, which tells him that he has reaped, and now he must sow again. Since the man has reached this level and gained all that it means in knowledge and certainty and peace, he must try to communicate these gifts to others. He must not rest satisfied with having attained them himself. 615. The Chohan goes on to remind the student of his qualifications. Thou art now a disciple, able to stand, able to hear, able to see, able to speak. And the explanation of the Master is that to be able to stand is to have confidence. Now, the man has that confidence because he knows. At the first initiation the disciple has received a definite touch with the Buddhic plane. He has had experience in connection with that, not necessarily of very long duration, but it has been definite, so that he knows for himself that there is such a reality, and that life is one. 616. Then comes a long note by the Master Hilarion, and we can see at once from looking at that note that he is dealing with the whole matter very differently in this second part. Before, he gave us what we might call a general comment upon what was said. Here he explains practically every word of the text, so that evidently he regards this as something much more difficult to understand, requiring explanation rather than mere comment. 617, he says to begin with. 618. To be able to stand is to have confidence, to be able to hear is to have opened the doors of the soul. 619. The expression, doors of the soul, reminds one of the Pali name given to the first qualification on the probationary path, which is discrimination between the real and the unreal. In Pali it is called Manadwaravijjana, which means, the opening the doors of the mind. Point 1, 1 Anti, Volume 1, Part 1, ch. 2, Initiation and the approach thereto. The man's mind becomes open to the difference between the things which are worth following and the things which are not, and so they say his mind has opened its doors to receive the truth. At initiation he has to open more doors, those of the soul. In other words, he has to acquire Buddhic consciousness. Then for the first time the man is really a soul, and is looking at things from the point of view of a soul. Below that level there is separation, due to matter, so even in the causal body he is still a long way from the real meaning of existence as the soul looks at it. But with the realization of Buddhic consciousness the man is drawn into a condition which differs in kind, not only in degree, from what has gone before. Therefore so much importance is attached to it. Therefore it is made part of the first initiation, though it is quite open to us to attain that consciousness apart from and before we reach initiation. 620, to be able to see is to have attained perception. 621. Although it is true that the initiate directly sees considerably more than the ordinary man of the physical world does, it is also true that from what he sees he can infer very much more than can be easily told or accurately understood. Thoughtful men have long been wondering, discussing and arguing as to whether or not God exists. No trained clairvoyant ever argues that question, because he knows. I do not mean to say that he sees God. No man hath seen God at any time, you will read in the Christian Scriptures. Point 1, 1 John 1, 18. That is not quite true if you speak of the solar logos, but even so it is true for the vast majority of students. But though most men have never seen electricity they have plenty of proof that there is such a thing, that we have light, and that our tramcars are driven by its agency, proves to us that there is such a force, though we have never seen it. Just in the same way the clairvoyant who has never seen the solar deity has yet seen sufficient evidence of his work to prove that he must exist. That is our position with regard to many theosophical doctrines referring to higher matters. We do not always know directly, but we see results. 622, no one below the rank of the adept can see the monad, but the arhat may know of its existence. On the nirvanic plane, which is that next below the habitat of the monad, we see a triple manifestation, which we call the triple spirit. Point 1, 1 Anti, Volume 1, Part 5, ch. 1, Liberation, Nirvana and Moksha. Volume Il, page 212, 248. The rays which make that threefold manifestation are obviously converging as they rise to the highest point. We can see that they must become one, though the actual unity is out of our sight. The phenomena which we see with regard to them indicate that they can be only three facets of one great body, or great light. So although we do not actually know by our own sight that the monad exists, we accept it on the evidence which we can utterly trust, the testimony of our masters, and the phenomena which we can see on the highest plane we can reach demand that there shall be such a reality as that. 623, we have been told by these great ones of certain things which as yet are out of our reach, but in every case when we have taken an additional step we have been able to realize more of those things which have been told. This has happened to us over and over again. So although when one attains the level to which this text refers, I do not say that he will see the logos, I do say he will see such evidence of his existence as will make it quite impossible to doubt it. Seeing that / and also the working of the evolutionary law, one gains absolute certainty that all is well. 624. A little of the higher sight does bring the certainty that all is well, and that is a very great thing indeed. I suppose that until one reaches it he hardly knows what it is, the absolute certainty that nothing can finally go wrong, that however dark things may seem it is only seeming. And presently the clouds will break and the everlasting sunshine which has been there all the time will show through once more. 625. It is perhaps not so hard with a little practice to think that all is going well for oneself. As we go through life we meet with all sorts of troubles and difficulties. And even apart from occultism the theosophically minded man soon comes to recognize that it is not so much what happens to him that matters as his own attitude towards the happening, that he can make himself very happy under circumstances which would make many other people miserable. The reverse is also true, a man may contrive to make himself unhappy amid circumstances which would make most other people happy. So it may not be so difficult to come to believe that all is working for good so far as oneself is concerned. But it is much harder to believe it for those we love, if we see them getting into trouble, making mistakes and suffering in various ways. It is much harder to believe that all is being properly managed as regards them, because one naturally feels a protective interest, one wants to shield them from these blows of karma. 626. They say that love is blind. It may perhaps blind one a little in that way. My own personal experience, however, is the other way, that strong affection makes a person particularly keen-eyed with regard to a fault, in order that one may help to get it out of the way. The proverb is taken to mean that one does not see the faults of the person loved. However that may be, when something of the sense of reality is attained, one of the great benefits that one gains from it is that he is then quite sure, both for himself and for those whom he loves, that all things are working together for good. And that the eventual result will in every case be the best that could be gained. It is a great source of peace to have that certainty. 627. To be able to speak is to have attained the power of helping others. 628. It is significant that he chooses speaking as the way in which we can most easily help others. It is true for most of us. We can do various things on the physical plane in the way of helping others, but perhaps the greatest help which we as theosophists can give to others is by speech, or writing, which is only another form of speech. We can put before them what we know. Very few of us have direct knowledge of these matters, but we have a certain interior conviction for which we could not, if pressed back to the ultimate, give an actual reason. What gives such tremendous power to what Dr. Bezanт says is that people feel when she speaks that she is speaking of that which she knows. She has in addition the most marvelous eloquence. One cannot hope to attain to that in a short time, for eloquence is not a gift. It has been earned, by very hard work continued through many lives. She has turned a great deal of her intellectual power through many lives in the direction of speech. The result of such practice is that she can do it well. I remember someone complimenting her on her wonderful eloquence. She replied, "Well, I have been speaking in public for 12,000 years. I suppose I ought to know something about it by this time." It is exactly that practice that has given her such remarkable power, and it is only by a commensurate amount of work that we can hope to gain it. However, any of us, without that marvelous eloquence, can speak about the things which we know, and our conviction will carry confidence to others. 629. Just in so far as we feel sure ourselves can we impart our conviction to others and be a real help to them, therefore if it were for that reason alone it is worth while to seek to attain that conviction. We should study more and more fully, and not be satisfied with merely superficial views of theosophical ideas, we need to live into them. I know there are members of the Theosophical Society who have belonged to it for 20 years and do not know any more now than the day they joined. But I also know that a great many of the older members have gradually lived into the teachings until these have become, as it were, part of themselves, and they are able to speak with certainty and indeed to feel a certainty which the newer students, however enthusiastic, do not readily acquire. It remains true now, as it was in the days of old, if any man will do his will, he shall know of the doctrine, whether it be of God. 1 John 7:17. The only way to attain certainty before one can see at all for oneself is to live as though it were true. In doing that, evidences will gradually accumulate round one that this is so, and though each one of those may perhaps seem small in itself, taken together they will constitute a testimony which one cannot doubt or deny. 630. To have conquered desire is to have learned how to use and control the self. To have attained to self-knowledge is to have retreated to the inner fortress whence the personal man can be viewed with impartiality. 631. The inner fortress is, of course, the ego in this case. There is a further stage where the inner fortress is the monad, with which the ego must be unified. I have already explained how the ego puts himself down into the personality. Let us have it clearly in mind. The monad puts down a ray of himself, that is about as near a simile as we can find for it, into the nirvanic plane, the next below his own. That breaks into 3 rays and becomes the triple atma, or triple spirit, and the 3 aspects of that descend one and manifest on lower planes until it appears as Atma-buddhi-manas, which taken together make the ego. Now that ego is only a partial manifestation of the monad, a small fragment of him, as it were, but nevertheless it behaves as though it were an entirely separate entity, just as the ordinary person thinks of himself as the separate entity, and is inclined to think of the soul as something which floats vaguely over him, like a captive balloon. 632. I believe that all theosophists who have not already done so, would do well to read Human Personality by Prof. Myers, because it is a most remarkable exposition of the relation between the higher and the lower, and it is especially interesting to our members, because he began as a skeptic and ended by having to admit apparitions. And in point of fact all that necessarily follows. I have seen him often. He used to be with Madame Blavatsky a great deal. He was much impressed by what she told him, but never got entire satisfaction. He was always seeking something definite from his intellectual point of view, and that is what practically cannot be given. It is at any rate overwhelmingly difficult to give in regard to anything on higher planes. One cannot express the functions or powers or conditions of the higher planes in terms of the lower at all. This is as impossible as to give the contents of a cube in square measure. The difference is precisely that kind of difference. 633. Professor Myers was seeking the expression of the higher world in terms of the lower. We can approximate. We can aim at it, and try to stimulate the intuition in our readers and hearers, but we cannot tell it in so many words, not because we are told we must not, but because it cannot be done. People must develop the higher faculties in order to see on the higher planes. We may tell them all we can about the astral world. When they reach that astral world in full consciousness, they will say, "The half has not been told me." That is true, because it cannot be told. These higher things cannot really be known down here, but at least partially to know them is already a very great comfort and advantage. We may not fully understand, but we know enough to be sure there is no need for fear and doubt, and that at least is a great and glorious benefit which theosophical study gives us. 634. To have seen thy soul in its bloom is to have obtained a momentary glimpse in thyself of the transfiguration which shall eventually make thee more than man. 635. When a man reaches the Buddhic consciousness he gains that wider insight which is more than insight because it is also feeling. And it is so wonderful, something so entirely new in the man's experience, that the master here refers to it again and again in different ways, approaching it from different points of view. To have the first glimpse of that which shall make thee more than man is to have this first touch of the unity with the Logos, that is, with the God of the solar system. But it must be remembered that at initiation a man does not attain the full Buddhic consciousness, nor does he in any way develop a Buddhic vehicle. 636. The pupil has already practiced himself in the development of the Buddhic consciousness so that he has usually had experiences at that level. But if he has not, his first experience now takes place, and that is directly related to the fetters which he is beginning to cast off. The first three which have to go are the delusion of self, doubt and superstition. These are all dispelled by that glimpse. He can have no delusion of separateness when he has recognized the unity. He can no longer doubt the facts. He is told he must not doubt evolution, the great law of karma, and the fact that the highest advance is to be attained by holiness. It is assuredly true, the man cannot doubt those things. He can see them in operation, and because he is standing there where many ways meet he knows that there are many roads and that they all lead to the one bliss. He can no longer hold to the superstition that any one form of belief is necessary to one who has attained that level. He stands upon the mountain peak and sees all the roads which lead up to it, and sees that all are good. So great stress is laid upon this Buddhic experience. From many points of view it is the attainment of a glimpse of that which shall make thee more than man. 637. For one who has attained adeptship it means still very much more than that, because he has definitely become one with a certain manifestation of the deity. As he shows himself in that set of planes which all taken together make the Prakritic plane, the lowest of the great cosmic planes, he shows himself as three and yet one, the ever-blessed Trinity which is yet a glorious unity. 638. Again and again we are told that we must keep these two ideas always in our minds when we think of him, that we must neither confound the persons nor divide the substance, but must try as well as we may to grasp the idea of this great mystery of the three who yet are one, which cannot be perfectly understood or explained. So much importance has at all times and in almost all religions been attached to a comprehension of that mystery that it is clearly of great practical importance. Many thousands of people have said that all such doctrines as these are merely of theoretical value, that they make no difference in practical life. That is not quite true. It is unquestionably a necessity that one should understand a little of this at least. All of it we cannot grasp, but at least we should know that there are these three lines of force, and yet that all the force is one and the same. Without knowing that we cannot grasp the method by which our world came into existence nor can we understand man, because God made man in his own image and man therefore has this same characteristic, that he is three and yet one. Now the three and the one in our cosmic Prakritic plane show themselves by an arrangement very similar to the Atmabuddhi Manas in man, or, it would be more correct to say that ours resembles that. 639. We have the highest spirit on the highest of our planes, and then the second aspect of that spirit which descends one plane, and so has within itself two qualities, that on the higher plane and that on the lower. People speak of it as dual. In Christianity we hear of Christ as God and man, and in the secret doctrine we read that, Father-Mother spin a web. 1, L. Op. Cit., Volume 1, pages 59, 111. That aspect is always two-sided. It is equal to the Father as touching his Godhead, yet when it descends one plane it is inferior to the Father as touching his manhood. Yet these two are not separate, but they make one Christ, and this Christ is one with the Father. 640. Then there is the third person of the blessed Trinity, descending to the second plane and standing there level with the Son, and then descending one stage further and manifesting in the higher part of what we sometimes call the nirvanic or atmic plane, still beyond anything we can reach. He abides there. Then it will be seen that there are three lines making all together a triangle. We have the horizontal line which connects the three aspects or persons at their own level. Then there is the perpendicular of the triangle, but coming down in this case from what we may call the base instead of going up to it, which links together the three different states or aspects of the three persons. Then there is the hypotenuse of the triangle. Now that line, the hypotenuse of the triangle, the square of which is equal to the sum of the squares on the other two sides, represents the deity. To us down below it represents the three persons as persons, and yet links them together into one. 641. A man attains adeptship when he raises his ordinary consciousness to the nirvanic level, and the very fact which differentiates him and an adept is that he has unified the monad with the ego. Since, then, he has become one with the monad, he has already reached the level of the third or lowest manifestation of the deity. Therefore that showers itself upon him in the manner which is typified by the description of Pentecost. After he has passed through the crucifixion and the resurrection which typify the Arhat level, he has before him the ascension, and after the ascension comes the descent of the Holy Ghost. In the symbol as it is given to us the Christ ascended. And the Holy Ghost descended upon the apostles, according to the story in which it is put before us, independently of the Christ, and after he had left. But in the great Gnostic doctrine in the Pistis Sophia it is said that Christ stayed 11 years after his ascension, teaching his people. Whence it will be seen that the descent of the Holy Ghost took place not after but very decidedly during his presence with his church. It must represent the attainment of adeptship of all those who are typified as the apostles, whoever they really may have been, because tongues of fire sat upon them. A statement which points very closely to certain phenomena well known in the East. 642. Those who have seen statues of the Lord Buddha or any of the great saints or deities of India will have noticed that there is often a curious little double dome at the top of the head. Very few have any conception of what it really means. There is at the top of the head a certain chakra spoken of sometimes as the thousand-petaled lotus. In the ordinary man it is a vortex or depression in the etheric body, but when a man attains to a certain high level he is able to turn that outward instead of inward, and make of it a mound instead of a depression. That is what they are trying to represent when they depict the Lord Buddha with that curious little double dome rising on the top of the head. That would glow and would give much the impression of a flame of fire. So, tongues of fire is by no means a bad poetical description. 643. The other strange phenomenon which is described in connection with that descent, the fact that they who spoke were heard by every man in his own tongue, is not, so far as we know now, a necessary concomitant of adeptship. But it does belong to a higher stage. I myself have known one instance of this phenomenon. It would appear that it descended upon those apostles at that time, if we are to take the record as representing an historical fact. 644. Clairvoyantly we have not seen the apostles arranged in that way. It is not that there was no such person as Peter, but there were many Peters. That was the title given to the head of each church, Petros, a rock upon which the church was built, because the leader of the church was the rock upon which it arose. It is not an inapt symbol. For we know how very often theosophical lodges and other organizations depend upon one person in just that way. It would seem that in the old days the same thing held good. There were those who could lead, and where there is a leader there will always be followers. So his knowledge is the rock on which that particular church is built. For the rest, we have not investigated sufficiently closely to speak with precision, but one cannot but doubt very much of this story, especially as Origen especially warned us not to take it as history. And compared it with the story of Hagar and Ishmael, of which it is written in the Bible, which things are an allegory. 1 Galatians 4:24. We obtain a much wider and more useful view of all these things if we apply that idea to them, because, as Origen puts it, whether these things happened in Judea or not, it is at least certain that through all eternity they are happening in the lives of Christian men, and that is the important side of the occurrence, not the material event. 645. Thus the adept becomes one in consciousness with the third person of the blessed Trinity. That must be something like the way in which, a whole plane lower, we find ourselves attaining to unity of consciousness. We find that others seem part of ourselves when we reach the full consciousness of that nirvanic level, all alike are then seen as facets of the one. 646. To recognize is to achieve the great task of gazing upon the blazing light without dropping the eyes, and not falling back in terror, as though before some ghastly phantom. This happens to some, and so when the victory is all but won it is lost. 647. It sounds very strange that any at such a height should fall, and yet some do. Before that level is reached all possibility of fear ought to have been entirely transcended, but there are those who shrink from these magnificent developments because they fear to lose their individuality. The same thing at a much lower level confronts a man after death. There are many who cling intensely to physical life, feeling certain of no other life than that. When the etheric double, which is composed of physical matter, is drawn out from the dense body, such a man, in his astral body, clings to the etheric counterpart, which still surrounds him, instead of letting it dissipate as it should. And so he lays up much trouble for himself. He lives in the grey world, as it is sometimes called. 648, we find the same phenomenon at this higher level. The man through all his incarnations has had a causal body. He identifies that causal body with his individuality, and shrinks from losing it. The bliss and the infinite light of the Buddhic plane loom before him, but he can reach it only by dropping his causal body, and that terrifies him sometimes. He is afraid that in losing that he will lose all, and will be merged into that infinite light, so he falls back at the very threshold. He fears the entire novelty of merging in union. He does not know that when he has so merged he will still feel himself just as much as before, and will feel not that the drop has been merged into the ocean but that the ocean has been poured into the drop. 649. Occasionally we have other examples of that at lower levels. The man functioning in his mind-body is sometimes afraid to let it go and to sink back into the causal body, which is no longer concrete, but abstract. So at that stage he halts and hesitates, and fears to pass. The progress of the person in any of these cases depends upon the power behind, the tremendous enthusiasm and devotion which is carrying him through. Since that is the propelling force, for the man to hesitate means that that enthusiasm fails, since fear and enthusiasm of that kind cannot exist together. The moment he allows himself to fear, by that very thought he shrinks back and falls away, and has no longer the place which he had attained. 650. There is a certain justification for the shrinking back in some cases, and I think that the ground for it is that if a man goes beyond the level at which he can be conscious he falls into a trance and loses himself. In India men talk of going into samadhi. We wondered what stage this could be, and identified it with various levels, one after another, and then found that it was not constant. It took a long time to discover that samadhi is a different thing for different people. It means the condition just beyond the level where the man is capable of retaining consciousness. For a savage whose consciousness is clear only on the physical plane, the astral plane would be samadhi. For most of those of our race who have not studied these matters, to enter into the causal body would be samadhi, because they would not be sufficiently conscious for the experience to be of any use to them. Many of us, if we could succeed in forcing ourselves into the Buddhic plane, would be unconscious at that level. That would mean that when we presently drifted back into our lower vehicles, we should come back without any definite additional knowledge. We should arrive with the sense of great bliss, a sensation of having bathed in all sorts of intangible glories, but with no definite knowledge and no new power of doing anything of use. 651. This kind of samadhi, the condition just beyond your consciousness, is not encouraged by our masters. Those great ones would say, by all means attain the very highest level you can reach, but do it consciously. Work your way up gradually, do not leap into it. Be careful, push steadily up, keeping your consciousness all the time you do it. There are possibilities which might be said to be dangerous. Nothing is actually dangerous, because at those higher levels one has not a separate life to lose in the same way that one has down here, but it is quite possible to be swept out of the line of evolution if one makes rash experiments. Yet this is not probable for the ordinary student, because he is working steadily away at levels which he knows, and aims at attaining. 652. The fact of the possibility of falling back, fearing to face the higher developments, was put strongly before us in the initiations of the ancient Egyptian mysteries. The candidates were taught that in the pursuit of knowledge they must be neither rash nor fearful. When the candidate was brought to the door of the crypt or underground hall in which these great ceremonies were held, he received a practical lesson in that way, for, as he entered, a sword was held in front of him touching his breast. To typify that he must not rush rashly forward in search of those mysteries, and at the same time his conductor led him by means of a rope thrown round his neck, so that if he had been frightened and rushed backward he would have injured himself. Afterwards this was explained to him. He was told that a man must have quiet confidence. He must never rush rashly into something which he did not understand, nor on the other hand must he draw back in fear when he encountered something which seemed terrible to him. 653. Our great founder, Madame Blavatsky herself, whom none could accuse of lack of courage, who dressed as a man and fought under Garibaldi in 1864, told me that when she was first taken into the presence of the Lord of the world, the one initiator, the great spiritual king of the world, she fell upon her face and could not look at him, because of the tremendous power and majesty in his face. It does not affect all candidates in at all the same way, but yet, if that were the result on a person so entirely dauntless as Madame Blavatsky, one may understand that it is no slight test to be brought face to face with the representative of the solar logos on this planet. It is a tremendous experience. 654. Those who become pupils of the Master will one day in due course be led by the Master up the path which leads to initiation, and then they must face the one initiator, not indeed at the first step, nor even at the second, but at the third and fourth. But before that comes they will have had so many experiences on the way to it that probably they will be to a great extent prepared. So had Madame Blavatsky, yet what I have said is what she told me. Although I entirely agree with her that that face is full of majesty and might, quite incredible power, beyond anything that you can imagine of power, yet it is also so full of love that it seems to me that one could not feel fear in his presence. Nor I think did Madame Blavatsky, but simply awe so great that she felt as though the light were dazzling and not to be faced, she felt it too great for her. 655. But what is spoken of here is not the meeting with the one initiator, but the meeting with one's own higher self, the entrance into that wider spiritual realm. Men do shrink back from that, as I have said, because they fear that when they plunge into that shining sea they may never come back again, that the individuality may be lost. A man who thinks would know that many others have plunged into it and have not been lost, but one does not always think at such moments, but acts perhaps rather by instinct. One must endeavor so to arrange one's instinctive action that it will be reasonable and right action. We must not shrink back before the divine, whether it shows itself in ourselves or in any other. It says here that some have done that. And so, when the victory was almost won, it was lost. That would be sad. But we should not let ourselves be deceived by the manner in which it is put. 656. Often we are warned that the higher a man rises the further he may fall. There are several reasons for that. One is that he may misuse the divine force which has come to him. The other is that he may fall into such a condition as to cause a leak in the channel which is composed of a number of disciples, including himself. The great ones send out a huge wave of force through such a channel, and cannot recall it. If the channel becomes defective, a great portion of the force may be lost. It is not always a vast outpouring in one direction, sometimes some of it goes in one way and some in another, to do different things, and only if all the various people who form the channel stand firm in their special lines is success assured. It would be a sad thing if one should fail, and so cause a leakage, which would be very serious on account of the great pressure of the force behind, and would result in a fall for that man. Again, for one to shrink back from good work within one's power through fear of the responsibility also involves a fall. 657. The further a man climbs the further he may fall, if he falls to the bottom. It would be a very sad thing that a man should fall back at this high point, but it is very unlikely that one who had climbed so high would fall to the bottom. We must not get the impression that a fall even such as is described in our text is fatal. Who mounts may fall, who falls will mount, the wheel goes round, unceasingly. There is no fatal fall, because it is God's will that every man shall progress, therefore every man will do so, and it is only a question of the rate at which he moves. 658, 1 The Light of Asia, Book the 8th. 659. For such a man to lose his position would be a great waste of high opportunity, but it would not throw him back to the beginning. It would mean that he must work deliberately to develop within himself the consciousness of his own divinity, and learn to trust it. 660. That would not be at all easy, of course, because a man who had lost control of himself at a critical moment, who had lost his nerve, would find it difficult to regain it. In climbing, if a man looks down and sees a great gulf below him, he will probably become frightened and fall, but the man who has never been frightened would be very likely to go on to the end and not have any fear whatever. The man who has once lost his nerve through looking down will take a long time to go safely on his way, but I do not want anyone to think that the man who falls will not recover. It is a sad pity, he ought to have known better. One cannot help seeing and saying that, but he will recover himself and go on again sooner or later. 661. It is very easy to say that one should have perfect confidence in one's divinity, but it is a more difficult matter when one comes face to face with some of these great trials. If there is a fall, at least one may be sure that the work done still counts, so there is no possibility of a fatal final fall. It is something like failing for an examination on the physical plane. It means a good deal of trouble, but the man still has all the knowledge he gained in working for the examination. When he is able to try again, he is tolerably certain to succeed. 662. It sometimes seems very sad when a man who is making good occult progress suddenly dies. One is apt to say, what a pity, if he had continued at that rate he would probably have reached initiation in this life. But what happens is karma and is for the best, and he will not lose what he has gained. The self retains all it has achieved. What it will have to do is to bring a fresh physical vehicle into subjection, but it will be very easy for it to do so up to the point it has reached, and only after that the difficulties will commence again. 663. To hear the voice of the silence is to understand that from within comes the only true guidance. To go to the hall of learning is to enter the state in which learning becomes possible. Then will many words be written there for thee, and written in fiery letters for thee easily to read. For when the disciple is ready, the master is ready also. 664. We have already seen that the ball of learning begins on the astral plane, the lowest plane upon which you can learn anything practically with regard to the higher states. That does not mean that there is nothing to be learnt on the higher levels, in the heaven world, for example. There is very much to be learnt, but for the ordinary man the astral plane is his hall of learning, and when out of his physical body in that astral world he will receive much of the teaching that must be given to him. There are very many students who do not quite understand what it means to be taken as a pupil by a master. Some seem to expect that if that great privilege came to them they would be constantly in receipt of teaching from the master, that he would especially instruct them with regard to minute details of their progress. When the master takes pupils on probation, it means much more that he watches them in ordinary life than that he specially teaches them anything. One main object, then, is to have the whole detail of the pupil's life and thoughts and feelings before him, so that he may know whether he can usefully take that pupil into the closer relationship. He must know that before he takes a further step, otherwise it might cause him a great deal of trouble, and it would not be worth his while from the point of view of the work. While he is on probation the pupil may be used as a channel for force, that often happens, but it is only when the closer link is made that he is in constant communication with the master. And even then he will not necessarily know of the communication. He may feel sometimes that the force is flowing through him, and a wonderful experience it is, a great privilege and delight to be used for the dissemination of the master's force. But he will not be instructed by the master except on very rare occasions. 665. In most cases an elder pupil is appointed to look after the neophyte and to give him such instruction as is necessary. One in my own case, Madame Blavatsky taught me very much on behalf of the master, but I was separated from her for some 5 years and sent out to India when she was in Europe. Consequently, it was impossible for her, except by occasional letters and on the astral plane sometimes, to give me any help. Therefore I was put into the care of Swami T. Subarao. He was an exceptionally patient teacher as to all the detail, and so I was greatly helped by him. 666, L. Ante, Volume 2, page 67, 103. 667. In those days I saw my own master only occasionally, and even when I did see him it was not usually anything in the way of teaching that he gave me, but rather instructions as to something he wanted me to do. But in process of doing the work one gained a vast amount of knowledge and training. The attempt to do some service, even without knowing how at first, shows one in what directions one is lacking. One then sets to work to fill those gaps, so as to be able to do the next piece of work better, and I think I may say for myself that it was in that way that I learnt most of what came to me. I would invent a way somehow or other to do the thing, and then see where the method might be improved, until I came to know how to put into practice the higher methods such as Swami T. Subba could give me. But it meant a great deal of hard work, of strain, and often very slow development. Still, it had to be done and it was done, and I think that is the way all pupils are trained. They will be given a piece of work to do, and in the doing of the work they will learn how to do greater work. But on this great subject of the relation between master and pupil I have written at length in The Masters and the Path. 668. Various possibilities of learning open before the pupil. Many of them are equally open to any of us on the astral plane if we choose to take advantage of them. We sometimes go to lectures on the physical plane in order to learn something about theosophy, because some people learn more easily by having facts told to them in that way. Whereas other people learn more easily by taking a book and reading on the subject. For those who like the spoken word there are always lecturers in occultism. 669. Some of those who are workers and helpers in the astral world devote most of their time to that branch of work. Our former vice president, Mr. P. Sinnett, used to take that as his share of the astral plane duties. He did not as a rule plunge into the ordinary work of the invisible helpers, but instead of that he had a department of his own. And was always to be found giving instruction upon theosophy to anyone who in that vast astral world would care to listen. In that way he brought many people, both dead and living, into touch with these great truths, for he happened to have a certain dogmatic method of stating his points which many people found very useful and easy to follow. Chapter 2. Rules 1-4. 670, CWL. In the last chapter we considered what is really a preface to the second part of the book, but now we come to the rules. Up to Rule 12 these are numbered in the same manner as in Part 1, Rules 1-3, 5-7, and 9-11 belong in sets of 3 to the ancient palm leaf manuscript, and Rules 4, 8 and 12 are comments by the Chohan. Further on the numbering follows a different plan. 671. In this chapter we will take Rules 1-3, and I will divide up the comment of the Chohan, which is Rule 4, into its 3 portions, and deal with them along with the rules to which they apply. 672. Stand aside in the coming battle, and though thou fightest be not thou the warrior. 673. He is thyself. Yet thou art but finite and liable to error. He is eternal and is sure. He is eternal truth. When once he has entered thee and become thy warrior, he will never utterly desert thee, and at the day of the great peace he will become one with thee. 674. The disciple must fight. He must throw himself into the evolution that is going on around him. He must struggle on the side of the spirit. Spirit is gradually learning to use matter. Having mastered it at a certain level it rises out of that to conquer a higher plane of matter, and to learn to use that. It is in process of dominating matter at all levels. This is going on all around as well as within us. So we enlist ourselves in this struggle, to smooth the way of the evolutionary forces. 675. We must make the personality stand aside in this strife for the progress of evolution, he must not come into the fight at all. The personality must be used, because it is only through that as an instrument that we can reach other people in the world, but we must not let the personal self obtrude itself. On each of the planes of personality one must get rid of the entanglement, while retaining the power. So we withdraw ourselves gradually from the physical, astral and mental bodies and yet retain the ability to function in them. 676. The higher interpretation of this aphorism applies when the personality has been set aside, and the man is at one with the ego. Then he learns that the individuality must be put aside, and looks for the consciousness of the monad. The monad must be allowed to work through the ego. 677. that the warrior is eternal and sure may be taken as relatively true of the ego in relation to the lower self. We may take it as absolutely true with regard to the monad in relation to the ego. The ego, as has been said, may often make mistakes at an earlier stage, but he is far less likely to do so than is the personality. The monad makes no mistakes. But on the other hand, if one may venture to speak of the monad as though one understood him when really one does not, one might say that the monad's knowledge of conditions down here would probably be somewhat vague. His instinct cannot but be on the side of right, for he is divine. He is eternal and is sure, as is said here, but it may be that the views taken both by the monad and the ego are often general, and in our efforts to apply them on this plane we may make errors. Because the whole purpose of descent into matter is to gain the precision and accuracy which result from perfect acquaintance with lower conditions. Since their evolution is not complete, both the monad and ego have not yet this accurate knowledge. They are for us the guides, one must not do other than obey them, but even these guides are themselves unfolding. 678. On the higher level the day of the great peace will be the attainment of nirvana. At the lower level it means the unification of the lower and the higher self. 679, 2. Look for the warrior, and let him fight in thee. 680. Look for him, else in the fever and hurry of the fight thou mayest pass him, and he will not know thee unless thou knowest him. If thy cry reach his listening ear, then will he fight in thee, and fill the dull void within. And if this is so, then canst thou go through the fight cool and unwearied, standing aside and letting him battle for thee. Then it will be impossible for thee to strike one blow amiss. 681. That seems a curious thing to say about the higher self, but it is true, he is reigned out splendidly, but indefinitely. Until one can see the ego in men one has no conception of how great a being an ego really is, how infinitely wiser and stronger than the incarnate entity. Still, there is no need for anyone to be proud or conceited about the fact that he is a very fine person, a magnificent person, at a much higher level, for so is every other soul of man. Every one is in reality very much better than he ever seems to be. The greatest saint can never fully express his ego, he is always on that higher plane a still greater saint than he can ever be down here. Therefore we must try to let this higher part of ourselves play through us. This ego is far finer, far better than the personality, but he puts forth the personality in order that he may evolve, to become himself more nearly perfect. He requires that evolution, so we must not make the mistake of regarding the ego as perfect, he is not. What he needs mainly for his evolution is definiteness, accuracy. He is magnificent but, if we may venture to say so, vague in his magnificence. 682. He desires to develop through that fragment of himself which is incarnated down here. He knows how to descend, but until he is himself to some extent developed he does not know how to guide the lower self. It is through the experiences of the lower self down here that he will learn how to do the things which he desires. His desire is evolution, he puts some of himself down, a tip of a finger, as it were into lower planes. That finger tip learns definiteness, but when it returns into him at the end of one short cycle of physical, astral, and mental life, what it takes back is only, if one might put it materially, a small amount of definiteness. Remember how the group soul has been gradually tinged by the experience of the different animals. 1. See a textbook of Theosophy, Chapter 4, for an account of group souls. The subject is too big to be explained here. A lion, a cat or a dog may go through certain experiences and acquire certain qualities which may be very well marked in it as an individual. There may be enough of courage to make a remarkably courageous animal of that one cat, dog or lion, but when you put that amount into a group soul for 100 there is only 100th part for each. So it needs a great many lives directed along similar lines in order that the quality may be strongly developed in the group soul as a whole. 683. Though the ego is an individual and is quite different from the group soul, yet in a way the same thing is true of him. He develops accuracy in a personality, but when that goes back into the ego the same amount has to be spread over the whole causal body. The amount which was quite sufficient to make one personality very accurate, when it goes into the ego, is only a fractional part of his requirements. He may need many lives to develop enough of the quality to make it prominent in the next life, since the ego does not keep a particular piece of himself which is to be the personality, but out of the whole mass of himself he puts down something. Yet not the same piece twice. 684, a highly developed ego, who has already acquired a great deal of accuracy, will understand the personality, and will work through it intelligently and try to make it an efficient instrument. But for the ordinary man of the world that is not in the least so. Therefore the personality must call out to him and then look for this influence. If the man down here, wanting to help in the plan, does this, the ego instantly responds, and immediately pours himself out through the personality, who should then stand aside and let the warrior fight in him. 685. The ego has many splendid possibilities, which only need awakening. That is one reason for the great advance which is often made by a rough man who goes to war and perhaps loses his life for his convictions, or in any case stands a very definite risk of doing so. To do a big thing like that, to set an ideal above his personal comfort, above the possibility of frightful pain, above the possibility, nay, even the probability, of death, wakens in the ego a very large response. 686. I have heard people argue somewhat against that. People have written to me saying, "You say that a soldier gains spirituality, but how can that be, because the soldier goes out inspired rather by hatred than by any noble feeling? Even if it be true that he has such a feeling against the enemy, if he has volunteered to fight for what he considers the right, he does a big, noble and unselfish thing. And that reacts on the ego and awakens it more than almost any other single action would be likely to do. Sometimes in private life a man has an opportunity for sacrifice which is greater than the risk of his life. He may, for example, devote the whole of his time to the uncomplaining and unselfish service of another, foregoing amusements and change, and watching by a sick bed, in a case of chronic illness. Such sacrifices are greater even than the dramatic heroism of the soldier. But they are only few, while in time of war many thousands go forth and take the large opportunity. The man makes a wonderful effort of self-sacrifice. Then the ego is aroused, and he pours down in response a splendid flood of devotion, capable of causing still more consistent sacrifice in another life. An effort of courage is perhaps required. That evokes from the ego a steady stream of courage, and so the man who loses his life shall find it, as Christ said long ago. He who has lost his life in such a way as this has certainly gained a much fuller life for his next incarnation, which will unquestionably be a bigger personality. The ego will be able to put down more of his power, and will also be much more able to direct the personality. 687. Another way in which, in the fever and hurry of the fight thou mayest pass him, becomes possible when men are devoting themselves to good works and they permit the personality to come up in them. It ought never to happen with students of occultism, but it does. There is a vast amount of good work being done in the Theosophical Society, and quite assuredly those who do it ought to be entirely above any sort of personal feeling in regard to it, but often they are not. A person feels, this little bit of work is mine, and therefore it must take precedence of other work. It is not that I am doing it for my own satisfaction and therefore do not want to see anybody else doing it. But I want to do it because I am quite sure they could not do it as well. Such an attitude is full of personal aggrandizement. To have any connection with work like ours develops a person, makes his feelings keener, and ought to make his intellect brighter. The very fact that it has this stimulating influence tends to accentuate the personality. But that is no excuse for the folly of permitting it so to do. 688. The same thing occurs in other organizations. In my younger days as a priest I had a great deal to do with church work of all sorts, including the training of choirs. The people concerned in that work are all laboring directly for the Church of God, supposed to be devoting themselves to something higher than the average man outside. Yet I think there is no other set of people among whom there is so much squabbling as there is among church workers and choirs. No one who has had to train them but will recognize that it is a fact. It is sad but true, and it ought not to be so. Yet it occurs precisely because they have been working in connection with something a little above the ordinary level, and in doing that the life in them has been roused more than is usual. 689. The disciple has to take care that his personality does not come up in these good works, because if it does he will lose sight of the higher guide. The ego can fight in him and work through him only when he is devoted to the work, not to his personal share or part in it. He may forget the higher self in a rush of personality, and then he will not be in a condition to receive his help, to listen to a hint from him, thus he may for the time shut himself off from the ego and lose the great benefit of his help. The vagueness of the higher self, unless he is a developed ego, would perhaps preclude him from indicating a particular line of work, but when the personality, being more definite, has found the work, the ego can and does pour himself down into it. And does enable him to do it in a much better manner and in an altogether grander frame of mind than the personality could attain unaided. 690. But if thou look not for him, if thou pass him by, then there is no safeguard for thee. Thy brain will reel, thy heart grow uncertain, and in the dust of the battlefield thy sight and senses will fail, and thou wilt not know thy friends from thy enemies. 691. All that is described here does occur when the personality does not look for the higher guidance. He does not know his friends from his enemies. He is carried away by the swirl of passion, and under its influence will believe what is said by someone who is not in the least a real friend. One sees that often in daily life. If a person is excited or angry or jealous, he will listen to the ridiculous gossip of those who call themselves friends but in reality are not friends at all. 692. A gossip, a mischief maker, is no one's friend. He is the worst enemy to those to whom he speaks. It is a very sad thing indeed for one who contacts a person of that sort, and believes what is said by him. As soon as we hear a person beginning to speak censoriously about someone else, it is best to avoid him as soon as possible, because we may be quite sure that we shall learn nothing of any good. And also that the person who speaks wrongly about another to us will speak in the same way about us to the next person whom he or she happens to meet. Therefore it is better to have nothing whatever to do with these gossiping people, and not to be in the least influenced by anything that they say. Often when a person hears what they say he replies, I do not believe it. I will not pay attention to it, but all the same he is somewhat affected by it. He lets it recur to his mind again and again, and wonders whether what was said could have had any foundation in fact, instead of at once treating it with contempt, which is the only reasonable attitude to take. 693. When once one knows a person well, one ought to be prepared to follow one's own knowledge of him, and not be swept away by what is said by others who may know him less. There are among us different dispositions of all kinds, but broadly speaking one cannot go wrong if one keeps to one's own knowledge of what a person is and thinks and does. Until one sees quite clearly for oneself that that person has in some way changed, and even then one must not take a single example. One must wait and see, because often for the moment a person is changed by a little ill health, or sleeplessness, and then he says and does things that he would not say or do under other circumstances. So one must not judge one's friend hastily by a single word or action, but must wait and see how things really are with him. 1 Anti, Volume 1, Part 3, ch. 5, Mind Your Own Business. To suppose him to be changed because somebody says he is absolutely unfair. When you have a friend, stand by him and wait until he himself says something or does something which supports this idea of what he is supposed to be thinking or doing or saying. Do not accept the evidence of other people who may be speaking under some mistake, made by carelessness or because they do not like him. 694. Just as a person who allows himself to be swayed in that way comes not to know his friends from his enemies and not to understand the facts at all, so also the very same happens to the man who lets his personality dominate him. If jealousy seizes upon him he becomes absolutely blinded. His normal senses are of no use to him. He does not listen to them at all, he makes up his mind beforehand on every subject and it is quite useless to try to turn him. It is very odd, and it is sad to see how ready people are to believe evil of others. The evil may be refuted, it may be clearly shown that there is no foundation for it, but still a certain suspicion remains. 695. All this should not be so, but it comes partly from an excess of the development of the particular part of ourselves in the evolution of which humanity is at present engaged. The lower mind learns by discrimination, by distinguishing differences between this thing and that, and therefore it always pounces first of all upon differences. Therefore when a man comes into contact with a person whom he does not know, with any idea which is unfamiliar to him, or with a book which he has not seen before, the general tendency is to seize first upon the things he does not like. Those which are different from the things to which he is accustomed, and then magnify them out of all proportion. The reason for this is that we have developed this discriminating faculty a little too much, or rather we have not yet developed the counterbalancing Buddhic faculty sufficiently. It is very well to be able to discriminate. It is a necessity. But we ought to have as well the spirit of synthesis, which sees likenesses as well as differences. 696. The teaching given in this passage also appears very emphatically in the Bhagavad Gita. 697. Man, musing on the objects of sense, conceiveth an attachment to these, from attachment ariseth desire, from desire anger cometh forth, from anger proceedeth delusion, from delusion confused memory, from confused memory the destruction of buddhi, from destruction of buddhi he perishes. 11 Op. Cit. 2, 62-3. 698. It is difficult, I know, for us to realize how the monad can be divine and yet at the same time undeveloped, how he can be different at the end of his incarnation in the individuality from what he was at the beginning. Let us take an analogy, imperfect as it is. The human body is composed of millions upon millions of cells. Those are human cells because they are part of the man, and yet if there be any kind of evolution, and perhaps there is, by which the soul of the cell can one day become the soul of a human being. Surely one would not say that in the end there had been no evolution, because the cell was human to begin with. That simile may suggest how the monad is part of the logos, yet not unfolded. It is not safe, I know, to make analogies of that kind from the lower to the higher, and then press them to fit into every detail, because usually they will not. There is a great occult saying, as above, so below, but the converse of that, as below, so above, is true only with narrow and restricting limitations. I think we may safely reason down, as the Hindus do, from what they are told exists above, to what therefore they must find somewhere below, in a general way. But it is not quite safe to reverse the process, because the arrangements on the higher planes are obviously greater and wider, though we do not know the ways in which they are so. We may often mislead ourselves if we say that because a certain thing happens down here it must also happen up above. Something which is an expression of the same law must happen up above, but it may take some form which we should not recognize. 699. The analogy of the cells within the body is not quite a safe one to follow far, but there are various points across which we come in our study which indicate that something of that kind is taking place. We know that the ensouling life of all the lower kingdoms becomes in its turn only a vehicle for a still higher life when man is individualized. The causal body that we are using now was the soul of some animal from which we individualized, so what is at one stage the ensouling life may later on become a vehicle. Stated in that way, however, this truth needs reservations, because although what is in man the causal body was all of the soul that could be seen with regard to the animal and the plant, yet it is matter on a definite level. And there must have been life from above, ensouling and vivifying that matter, unseen. We must remember always that the energy, the spirit, we can never really see, but only its manifestation in some form of matter. Let us take this physical body as an example. What is it that is ensouling that? It is the man in his astral body. That astral body we cannot see, therefore at this stage it is to us the soul. If astral sight is developed we find that it in turn is energized by something higher. That proves to be the mental body. And that in turn is energized by the ego, and so it goes on, all the way up. What to us appears the ensouling life is never the real spirit, but some manifestation of it. When we get to the highest that we can, the bubbles of Koilan, in the true ether of space, to our present sight appear to be empty. Of course they are not so, because there is in them something which has power to hold the incredible force of the ether apart. Therefore very decidedly there is something in that apparently empty space. At present we cannot see it, but perhaps later developments may enable us to do so. Then what we see will not be the ensouling spirit, but some higher form of matter through which that ensouling spirit is manifesting. The higher force is never seen at all. 703. Take his orders for battle, and obey them. 701. Obey him, not as though he were a general, but as though he were thyself, and his spoken words were the utterance of thy secret desires, for he is thyself, yet infinitely wiser and stronger than thyself. 702. We must learn that whenever there is a conflict between the higher and the lower, we are the higher. At first we do not feel definitely that it is ourself. Believing that it is so from our teaching, we must act as though we felt it to be so, and then very soon we shall find that it is true. Our danger is that we may identify ourselves with the lower and forsake the higher. Chapter 3. Rules 5 to 8. 703, CWL, Rules 5, 6, 7 and 8 fall into one of our familiar groups. I will divide Rule 8, which consists of the comments by the Chohan, into the 3 portions appropriate to each of the shorter rules, and deal with them along with those rules, as in the last chapter. We have thus. 704, 5. Listen to the Song of Life. 705, Life itself has speech and is never silent. And its utterance is not, as you that are deaf may suppose, a cry, it is a song. Learn from it that you are part of the harmony. Learn from it to obey the laws of harmony. 706, on Aphorism 5 there is also a long note by the Master Hilarion, which begins. 707, look for it, and listen to it, first in your own heart. At first you may say, it is not there. When I search I find only discord. Look deeper. If again you are disappointed, pause and look deeper again. There is a natural melody, an obscure fount in every human heart. It may be hidden over and utterly concealed and silenced, but it is there. At the very base of your nature you will find faith, hope, and love. 708. What is meant is that underneath all life, and exhibited more or less according to the state of development of each life, is the great force that moves all things. In Christianity we have been taught to call it the will of God, or the love of God, but people very often use these religious terms in a vague way, so that they lose much of their reality and power. In popular religion there are several of these expressions which have a certain historical or traditional connotation, but really do not actually mean much to the people who use them. People talk, for example, about the grace of God, but I think very often they have but little idea of what they really mean. Again, when in church the litany is recited, people say, "Spare us, good Lord." That is a most amazing and utterly illogical and impossible sentence, but nobody ever seems to think of it. They say "spare us" and call him "good Lord" at the same time, a contradiction in terms. A good Lord would never need to be asked to spare anybody. To ask that is worse than wrong, because it suggests evil in God. It is blasphemy even worse than that of using his name in casual swearing, as people sometimes do in the streets, though that is bad enough. They are attributing to him human passions, and malignity at that, and are asking him not to exercise his malignity upon them. 709, in the same way people speak of the mercy of God. That again contains very much the same idea, that he might do something quite dreadful to you, but instead he elects to show mercy. Certainly all such phrases imply an utter misunderstanding of what the word God means. It is the grandest, the finest word that exists, it means the good, and he who is good needs no entreaty to show mercy in a certain case, for he is always so full of love that the idea of anything else but mercy would be utterly unthinkable. God will certainly show love to all, irrespective of what they do. I do not know how people think a loving father would be likely to feel, if he found his children crawling to his feet and begging him to have mercy upon them. 710. We have that difficulty to fight against when in theosophy we try to talk about these higher forces. Those of us who have come through the various churches and chapels unfortunately have been accustomed to speak about such things freely, but to think of them as being utterly vague and meaning nothing in particular. People go to church and perhaps ask for the divine blessing, with a general idea that God will look after them or something of that kind. I am afraid it is a very unscientific conception. What one ought to understand is that a church service is a means intended to convey a perfectly definite force. This thing, the blessing of God, is a force absolutely as definite as electricity, as real as the steam that moves our trains, and it flows through the channels appointed for it, through the priest or the bishop. When he extends his hand, a definite force flows from it over the people. There is a very definite raying out of force, which floods the whole church, and is received and appropriated by such people as have made themselves ready to receive it. It is true that some may sit there and not be influenced, but that is only because they have not in any way previously prepared themselves. 711. So when people talk about the love and the grace of God, they are usually thinking vaguely about things which are in reality very definite forces. It is sometimes hard for us to rid ourselves of this loose method of thought. It is not only those who have come along the line of the churches who suffer from it, but also those who have not, have lost something. Those who have come through this line have acquired in the process certain attitudes and powers of comprehension which those who have been free thinkers have not so easily to hand. The Orthodox Church training is on the whole a good training, except for its bigotry and narrowness, and for the conception of God which it so often puts before its people. For the rest, the ideas of serving God by worship and by praise, and of gathering together so to worship Him, and to employ in that worship all such beauty as can be provided, are fine and beautiful. And I think that it is quite possible for them to coexist with the widest and most liberal doctrine. They have not so coexisted for many centuries now, unfortunately, except in the case of a very few people, here and there. I have long believed that a church would sooner or later spring up which would combine these things, and now we have it in the liberal Catholic Church. Those people who love the old church and her methods, her ritual and music, and all the beauty and gentleness of holiness, are now able to have all that. And yet at the same time to have with it a doctrine which is to all intents and purposes theosophy. 712. So when in theosophy we use terms corresponding to those which are commonly used in this vague way, we should understand that they are not cloudy or indefinite in any sense. If I speak of giving to anyone the blessing of the Master, I mean a definite pouring out of a spiritual influence. It uses as its vehicle matter at a higher level than the physical plane, in most cases, but nevertheless it employs matter through which it influences the matter of the causal or mental or astral body, as the case may be. So let us altogether divest our minds of the least fragment of thought that this is a vague good influence which does not mean anything much. 713. This great force that moves all things has another side to it, which is the law of sacrifice. Sacrifice is a grand word, but people generally use it wrongly. They talk about making a sacrifice when they give up something, and it tears the heart to do so. If men want to know what sacrifice really means in religion, they will have to wipe that idea out of their minds. They must take an entirely new interpretation of a word they have known all their lives. They may sometimes think that they now hold the true interpretation and have set aside the other, when the shadow of the old idea is still upon them, and it comes up and clouds the mind without their being aware of it. Only gradually will it fade away completely. 714. The word sacrifice comes from the Latin sacrificio, I make holy. To sacrifice a thing is to offer it to God, thereby making it holy. The idea that when you offer it to Him you take it away from yourself is a secondary meaning introduced into it. If you want, as it is so often expressed in the Scriptures, to make yourself a perfect sacrifice unto God, there must in that be no idea of giving up anything at all. The truth is, though it sounds paradoxical, that as long as you feel anything to be a sacrifice it is not really so, it is not made holy at all. You are giving it but with a grudging hand. When you feel that you cannot do other than pour yourself out, as it were, carrot at the feet of God or of Christ in perfect devotion. When you have no thought at all of giving up anything, because in the very nature of things you could not do otherwise from the way in which you feel. When what you have within you makes it so that there is nothing else in the whole world that you could do but yield utterly to him, perhaps then you are a perfect sacrifice. It is only when we have altogether forgotten the ideas that are ordinarily connected with the word that we can make a true sacrifice. It is a glorious word, but it does not mean to give up, it means to make holy. 715. The Logos himself makes the greatest sacrifice of all, for he pours himself down into matter. He limits his power and sheds his glory, truly, for us men and for our salvation he came down from heaven. Those are beautiful words, but the meaning that is attached to them in modern days is often far from that, it is often altogether a degradation of the real idea. When understood, these ideas are seen to be beautiful and glorious and entirely to be commended and admired, but we must understand first. So the Christ makes of all sacrifices the greatest, and we, in so far as we dedicate ourselves to his service, take part in that sacrifice and make ourselves one with it. If one has once seen the reality behind, one can do no other than this. But then the world would no longer think of it as a sacrifice, because it would seem to be following one's own will. Then the man goes on working with the evolutionary force, but he has forgotten what he gave. It is no longer a matter of giving up anything, but of having reached the true realization of oneself, and of knowing what one is here for. The thought of the Logos is such as that, and we must be like him if we would truly sacrifice. 716. Dr. Bezanт has said that the fact that there is no religion in the world which is not full of ideas of sacrifice shows that there is some great esoteric truth underlying it. The law of sacrifice has not been fully studied as yet, although a master once said that it is as important as those of reincarnation and karma. 717. To see that reality behind things is to listen to the song of life. The song of life is the force which is all the time running under life. All the different movements in nature have sound and color as their expressions and accompaniments, there are others of which we know nothing, but at least sound and color are within our experience. It is possible to learn to hear something of the harmony of nature and to see something of its beauty and glory and order. And it is in that way more than in any other that one may come to be quite certain that all things are working together for good, and that the order which underlies this apparent disorder is out of all proportion and in every way greater, more important, more effective. The disorder is nothing but a slight disturbance, foam on the surface, the real depth of the sea lies beneath, and that obeys the divine law perfectly, even though on the surface that law may seem to be set at naught. 718. It is important for us to try, if we can, to sense the reality which lies behind, to feel that which is incapable of being turned aside or disturbed in any way. It is a great comfort, a great consolation, a great security, when once we can get into touch with this, and feel absolutely sure that everything is marching steadily on its way, and that therefore it does not matter what happens on the surface. Because it is at worst a small temporary annoyance, a little flutter. All the while we are moving onwards towards unity with the One. We are all the time part of it, we are moving towards the realization of that, and the One through us is developing his manifestation of himself. 719. There is a song, a great chord of harmony, as it were, always sounding beyond the worlds. In classic days they spoke about the music of the spheres, the idea being that the sun, the planets and the stars, moving in their courses, produce a mighty harmony. In the Old Testament, too, we read that, the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. 1 Job, 38:7. Many people think of that as a beautiful expression, but merely poetic symbolism. A common proverb speaks of things as, too good to be true, but everything good and beautiful must be true, because it is good and beautiful. Wherever there is a fine idea, there is a basis for it. One could not think it unless there were something corresponding to it on the higher levels. All the highest and noblest and greatest things are the divine thoughts. Our thoughts are high and pure and true and noble just in proportion as they reach up towards that. We must try to acquire this idea, not as a poetical conception to play with, but as a real basic fact, that above all and in all and at the heart of all there is always the beautiful and the true. The ideas commonly put before us are man's thoughts about things, the realities behind things are God's thoughts about them, as God is greater than man so are his thoughts higher than our thoughts. Higher does not mean more austere, or more unpractical, or more distant from ordinary life, but greater, more beautiful, more glorious. 720. We are listening to the song of life whenever we try to find in everything that which is best and most beautiful. All students of occultism must necessarily be optimists, because they know that the facts far more than justify the most optimistic view that we can possibly take. The truth behind is always grand. We misunderstand it and fall short of it. That is not the fault of the truth, but of our lack of comprehension. So in many ways, some of them small ways, in daily life we may listen to this song of life, and when once we do come to hear it we shall not entirely lose the sound again. It is to be heard on all the different planes. Even if we could hear the entirety of the song on one plane we should still have only a very small part, one note. As we reach plane after plane we shall always find more and more of its beauty and glory. The more one hears of it the more perfect the harmony becomes. If one struck all the notes of an octave at once one would not get harmony, but discord. But on the higher planes there is what I can only describe in a somewhat paradoxical way, the possibility that the more notes you are able to strike the more perfect is the harmony. Because there all things fit into one another in a way which down here one cannot in the least degree suggest. If part of a melody is in one key and part in another we get an effect of disharmony. If we could imagine some kind of projection into space in which each of these parts would work itself out in perfect harmony within itself, and then a scheme in another direction in which those parts would blend together, in which each of those harmonies would be one note, it might give an idea of it. It is not possible to put it into words. But the effect of it is that you can so project a number of keys, which here would be discordant, that they make in higher worlds a perfect harmony. 721. Much modern music is less harmonious than the older music. It plunges into wild discords and seeks thereby somehow to produce a finer harmony. It does not succeed in doing so. But I believe that the people who are working at it are gaining glimpses of this of which I have been speaking, and are trying to express it. They are seeking for some method whereby discords will produce harmony. I do not think it can be done on the physical plane, but I must confess I do not like these curious later manifestations, and therefore I am probably far from understanding them. The people who compose all this weird music are probably aiming at something the astral and mental counterparts of which will not be discords but harmonies, but at this level they produce an effect which is not harmonious. I suppose those who have come to appreciate it have learned how to produce the effects in their higher bodies, and so they like that queer and inharmonious sound. 722. Many of the curious modern manifestations of art, not only in music but also in painting, are definitely struggling towards the future, and they are producing effects beyond that which can be seen and heard. What can be seen and heard is very unbeautiful in many cases, but I can well imagine that they are aiming at something which will be very beautiful when the result is attained. One wishes that it might be reasonably harmonious on all planes, so that even down here the thing might be beautiful in itself for those who do not understand the higher side. 723. I have heard a number of people say that one piece of music sounded much the same to them as another. There are many of us who get a certain amount of vague pleasure from music, but do not in any way understand it. There are others to whom a piece of music is not only pleasing to the ear, but to whom it is as definite as speech in a lecture would be, to whom it conveys a clear form, which they can see and appreciate. I have heard great musicians speaking among themselves, and I therefore realize that the thought form with which a composer writes a certain piece of music can quite definitely be conveyed to another Rhone. I met with such a case when I was in Italy a few years ago. A man wrote a piece of music which was intended to represent a fountain in a garden, and this fountain had 3 basins one above the other. As he wrote his music describing this he had that thought form in his mind. I know the same thought form was conveyed to another musician who had never seen the fountain or the garden, and had no idea of what the music was intended to portray. When he played it, it called up the exact picture before him, so that he knew which parts referred to the different basins of the fountain and which part was descriptive of the garden. I could see certain correspondences, but until I had heard what it meant it did not call up the picture to me. That is a higher musical development. When we are at the level when we can sense a meaning like that in music, it will convey more than it does at present to most of us. The same thing is true of a picture. Precisely what it conveys to one differs from what is indicated to another. Some are like the man in Wordsworth's poem. 724, a primrose by the river's brink. 725, a yellow primrose was to him. 726, and it was nothing more. 727. But to the poet the primrose suggested a host of beautiful ideas. When this faculty is definitely established we shall arrive at a condition of thinking in symbols. The ego does that in his causal body. He thinks in symbols, not in concrete things, and quite evidently one way of psychic unfoldment is along that line, although it is very different from the more ordinary form of development. 728. Many of the newer forms of art, such as the futurist and cubist pictures, things which are like nothing in heaven or earth, but may symbolize something at higher levels, are at present in a transition stage. It is half-done work. They always say that children should not be allowed to see half-done work. Some of us are only children in this respect, so we do not appreciate it, but when it is completed it may be a great success. The Song of Life is not one part, but a whole orchestra. It is a vast number of melodies all run together, and it may be that the votaries of the new art are reaching up towards another manifestation which as yet we do not see. 729. Great changes may take place in art and music, as well as in religion, social reform and politics, when the world teacher comes. We think habitually of him as leading us in religion only. I do not know why we should confine our ideas to that, because surely there is a great deal of human evolution outside of actual religious teaching. I do not mean that religious teaching ought not to permeate our entire life. I think it should, but that very religion may manifest itself in many different lines. It may therefore be that the teacher will show us how these things should be done, that he will inspire not only the priest, but also the poet, the artist, the sculptor, the musician, and the scientist. When we get a more modern presentation of religion, one more in harmony with the particular stage of evolution which humanity has now reached, it may well be that that new statement will give us a wonderful impulse along all these lines. Very truly, his message will bring us nearer to the comprehension of the Song of Life in all ways. It will show us more of the underlying glory, and beauty, and harmony and order. 730. It is important to realize order. We are now passing through a democratic phase of things, in connection with which it seems inevitable that there should be considerable manifestation of disorder. Some people, in fact, rather glory in disorder, call it individualism, and say that every man must go his own way no matter what happens to the rest. It is necessary that people should learn to be able to go their own way. It is also necessary that, when they have done that, they should also learn to subordinate their wills to the divine will. Having developed the power to stand alone, and the powers to act and think, they must learn to use them only in the right direction. One must have a will to subordinate to the divine will. When a man has no will, life is quite easy, because he lets everything drift and trusts in providence. The people who have developed a will sometimes assert it against the divine will, and really it seems better for their evolution that people should be strong enough thus to go wrong in order that they may presently go right. Because the people who have not the will to do either good or evil are not likely to be particularly useful, nor to go very far. 1 Anti, Volume 2, p. 131. 731. To follow the divine will is to listen to the Song of Life. The more we seek it the more we shall discover it. As we reach plane after plane, we shall hear it more grandly and more fully. It is said here that even now we may form some faint idea, may see some dim reflection of the splendor of the whole, because this Song of Life is within us, and if we look deep down we shall find it. We have the divine spirit, the divine breath within us. It is crusted over by what we call our human nature, and so the melody does not readily come through, the spark burns low. But it is there, and that spark is never separate, as we thought it. It is always part of the totality of the divine flame, and our duty is to make these lower selves of ours lamps through which that can shine. There is always within us a manifestation of the divine which is not soiled or in any way clouded by its association with matter. If we can realize ourselves as that, matter will no longer have any power over us. But to do that fully means a very high development, perhaps even more than adeptship. Always there is that manifestation, absolutely unstained, unclouded, untouched. If we can realize even a little our oneness with that, feel that that is, we shall hear the song of life always. However we may be surrounded by the struggle and clash of the lower worlds, that song will always be sung within us. We shall do our work in the outer world in utter peace and contentment, because we know that within is the only real truth and all the rest is merely a temporary manifestation. Some touch with our own higher consciousness or that of the Master is often the beginning of the hearing of this melody. It brings a sense of that inner life, of rejoicing, of bliss, of conquest, a feeling that you have been victorious in a great struggle. 732, the Master's note continues. 733. He that chooses evil refuses to look within himself, shuts his ears to the melody of his heart, as he blinds his eyes to the light of his soul. He does this because he finds it easier to live in desires. But underneath all life is the strong current that cannot be checked, the great waters are there in reality. Find them and you will perceive that none, not the most wretched of creatures, but is a part of it, however he blind himself to the fact and build up for himself a phantasmal outer form of horror. 734. If a man chooses evil it is because he refuses to look deep within himself. It is scarcely that he chooses evil intentionally, but as he never goes deep down into himself at all, he mistakes his astral vehicle for himself, and so lives in his desires, following the lower path because he wants to satisfy them. It is because he will not face the facts of life that he is working against the current of evolution. Long after he has reached the point where he could change over to the higher life he usually averts his face. It is too uncomfortable for him to realize that he has gone far on the wrong road, that he will have to turn round and face a great deal of hard work and trouble and sorrow, arising from the fact that he has set up an impetus in the wrong direction. It may not seem to be a very serious matter that there are many people in that state, but if a man having those characteristics reaches a position in which he has it in his power to do much good or much evil, he is in very great danger from the point of view of occult progress. 735. When one reads passages like this, one thinks usually of a man who takes up black magic on a grand scale, but it is equally true with regard to smaller matters. The man who will not face facts is very liable to be led away into the easier but more dangerous path. He will do what is easy, instead of what is right. We have to see ourselves frankly as we are. The man who willfully declines to do so has probably reason to fear that if he did see himself face to face he might not like the prospect. Still, it is possible to err in the opposite way. To fall into a condition of morbid introspection is really a serious trouble and difficulty, as we saw in studying at the feet of the Master. 1, Anti, Volume 1, Part 2, ch. 5, Unselfishness and the Divine Life. The people who are always pulling themselves up by the roots to see how they are growing do not make progress. The great thing is to make sure that you are set in the right direction, that you are trying to work for good, and then go quietly and steadily on and do the best you can. Do not worry about your own progress. It is necessary, truly, that you should make progress, but the best progress is made when you are not thinking of it, when you have lost all thought of yourself in doing some good and useful work for others. 1 Anti, pages 55, 162. Such advance as I have myself been able to make in the course of the last 45 years has come absolutely and entirely from throwing myself into any work that had to be done, and leaving the question of advancement to take care of itself. 736. It is true that the man who blinds himself to the fact that he is divine builds for himself a form of horror. Our difficulty in dealing with him is that what we meet down here is the form of horror and not the soul behind. Nevertheless, we have to try to realize that that soul is there. I believe I have mentioned before that I had a certain amount of experience as a lay helper in the church in my younger days in one of the worst parts of London. In the course of my experience there I met with people who were perhaps as low and degraded as anyone would be likely to find in the world. They had no thought of gaining any sort of honest or reputable livelihood. Their only idea of life was to steal and to commit outrages of various kinds. They knew absolutely nothing more. Those who live under better conditions have very little conception of life among the real London poor. I have known 5 families living in one room, one in each corner and one in the middle. They got on fairly well in a curious pigsty sort of way, until the party in the middle took in a lodger, and then there was a fight. In the newer countries there is scarcely anything resembling the slums of Britain. In every race there are men more and less advanced, but in Britain we have produced extreme conditions, because we have not always lived up to our powers and responsibilities. In some cases we have massacred savage races, have slaughtered them as wild beasts, have gone out to shoot them as men shoot game. In many instances those who were so treated have in consequence incarnated in our own race, and become slum dwellers. Though they are given the opportunity of a body of a superior race they are usually unable to take much advantage of it, especially while their surroundings are so bad. 737. When people are living under conditions like that I do not think we can expect anything very high in the way of morality, or humanity. These people, with a record of crime behind them, with a heredity of crime from their fathers and mothers, and living under terrible conditions such as I have described, nevertheless always had some little spark of something better in them, a little kindness that they would show towards a sick neighbor, to a child, to a dog. I remember one man who was a very bad case indeed, and I think the only gleam of anything I saw of good in him was that he had a strong affection for a dog, and would share his last morsel with him. The divine spark exists in every one of those people, and will show through when you least expect it. You know it is always there, and that is something to work upon. If there should ever be a case where you cannot find any trace of it, be sure all the same that it is there. 738. While we should always try to remember the glory that is behind a man, and that it will be in evidence in some future life, we have yet to face the fact that the external presentment at present is often very defective. We must try to help the divine spark to manifest, though we shall find cases in which we can scarcely touch it. It is not given to every one to find the way. We meet with persons for whom we cannot do very much. We try, we do our best. It may not be the man's karma that we should be able to help him, it may not be our karma to be strong enough to find the way in that particular case. In these affairs we must always remember the importance of common sense, and must not permit ourselves to be swept away from that into helplessness or despair on the one side, or into any kind of sentimentality which will blind us to obvious facts on the other. It is often said that there is only one step between the sublime and the ridiculous, and one may sometimes make that which is noble and beautiful quite ridiculous by pursuing it too far, or carrying it to an exaggerated length. There are many such instances and possibilities in connection with our theosophical teaching and work. 739. The divine life is in every one, but in many cases it may be showing itself but poorly and dimly. We have then to deal with the matter as it stands. On the physical plane, for our life as a community, we must have certain laws. Those who offended against those laws, who become what is called habitual criminals, must be dealt with in some way that will help both them and the community. I know that some people carry the idea of the indwelling light so far that they say the criminal ought not to be restrained. That seems to me to be foolish, because we should then be delivering ourselves over into the hands of the criminal, and life and order and progress would become impossible for thousands of people whose opportunity of progress is very much better, who are far more important for the progress of the world than that criminal. 740. We must do no wrong to our criminal. We should treat him as a case, as a sick man, rather than as a wicked man, because the habitual criminal is a person who is mentally defective. Clever he may be along certain lines, but he is certainly deficient in other ways. He is unable to see the necessity for unselfishness and unity and solidarity, otherwise he could not be the habitual criminal. Those who have read the works of Prof. Lombroso will remember that, after a long series of experiments, he came to the conclusion that all habitual criminals were defective in brain, and that in all cases, clever though they may be, their brains weighed less than the brains of normal men. He said that certain parts of the brain were not yet in activity in them. 741. The usual idea of taking revenge upon the criminal is surely quite the wrong way to approach the matter. It seems to me unworthy of a civilized body of people. We must protect ourselves against the attacks of the criminal classes, but since they are also men and brothers, even though very much younger brothers, we should try in protecting ourselves to help and educate them, not to be revenged upon them. There is an idea that other crimes may be prevented by making an awful example of one person. 1 Anti, Volume 1, Part 5, ch. 4, Cruelty. That is doing evil that good may come. History shows that good does not come in that way. 742. All these forms of horror are phantasmagoric. They have no existence in the divine reality. They say in China that evil is but a dark shadow of good. We have produced most of the evil in the world because we have not worked in harmony with the divine laws in this life or in past lives. If it were possible that we could all work in harmony with them, evil would be eliminated. It was necessary that some free will should be gained in order that we might learn how to use it, but quite naturally and with no blame attached to anybody we have used our free will wrongly about as often as rightly. And the consequence of that has been the introduction of what we call evil into the world. But always it is a mere surface disturbance, always in the deep waters behind are the great currents of the divine life, and the evolution which the Logos has mapped out for us. Those are the permanent realities of life. The other is only superficial, though to us it often seems of tremendous importance and of very great power. In reality, as compared to the rest, it is not at all a powerful thing. The great waters are not affected by anything that we can see. In some mysterious way it is true that, blindly the wicked work the righteous will of heaven, as Southey said. In that sense it is that one say to you, all those beings among whom you struggle on are fragments of the divine. And so deceptive is the illusion in which you live that it is hard to guess where you will first detect the sweet voice in the hearts of others. But know that it is certainly within yourself. Look for it there, and once having heard it, you will more readily recognize it around you. 743. If we can look at things from the point of view of the ego in the causal body, still more if we can penetrate to the next plane, the Buddhic, we shall see the real meaning of all this. It is no longer one little part of the lower side of it all that we then see, but the whole thing, and we can realize what the proportion is, and see how really small it is, how the evil is null, is not, is silence implying sound. That is truer than perhaps Browning knew when he wrote it. Behind and beyond and above all the evil we may be very sure that the great current is steadily flowing, that the song of life is to be heard, if we go down deep enough to hear it, for the soul of things is sweet. And the heart of being is celestial rest as the Lord Buddha told us long ago. 744. We have to find the way to God by the cultivation of the spark until it becomes a flame. It will then burn away the walls that the individuality has built up, but in destroying them it will not lose the strength and definiteness which it gained in building and using them. So the power which it thus gains will enable it eventually to act not as a spark, but as a sun radiating life and light through a vast solar system, and then, indeed, man will have become as God. 745. We may now consider the Chohan's comment on Rule 5. 746. Life itself has speech and is never silent. And its utterance is not, as you that are deaf may suppose, a cry, it is a song. Learn from it that you are part of the harmony. Learn from it to obey the laws of the harmony. 747. Down here on the surface one sees plenty of confusion, of crying and sorrow and misery and grasping and overreaching and ill will, and one might well think that if one could penetrate to the heart of life one would find it a cry for help. A cry of misery. But it is not, one will find it is not a cry, but a song. Whatever the spray on the surface may do, whatever currents and eddies may be seen here by our outward eyes, the mighty current goes steadily on, and it is that which counts, that which makes the mark. 748. The cry for rest and peace is often all that we can hear in the physical world. When we rise to the higher planes we realize that the whole current of life which flows from within is not uttering any cry for rest, but is singing a glorious song of triumph as it flows steadily onward in the way which God has appointed for it. You may learn from that song, as is said here, you are part of the harmony and you may learn from it to obey the laws of the harmony. All this wonderful and glorious universe is an expression of God's will. It moves steadily on as He means it to move, and all that we have to do, if we would only understand it, is to make ourselves an intelligent part of that movement, to see what it is that He wants us to do, and then do it. 749. There is no difficulty and there never has been any difficulty in knowing what He wants us to do, for religion in the world from the earliest times of which we have any record has taught precisely this with regard to the actions of men. They have had as many forms of belief, and as many different names for things, as there have been religions, but all of them are agreed as to what a man should do. That is the important thing, and it is strange that people cannot be induced to see that idea and to work with it. They all agree that the good man is the man of generous heart, the unselfish man, the kindly man who does not oppress others but tries in all ways to help them on their way, the man who is charitable to the poor, who will give food to the hungry and drink to the thirsty and clothes to those who are naked, and will visit those who are sick and in prison. These are the things of which Christ is reported to have spoken as deciding the fates of men. 1 Matthew 25, 35-40. In Buddhism, the last of the religions founded by his great predecessor, the Lord Gautama Buddha, you will find exactly the same virtues laid down. When the present world teacher came to us in his incarnation as Sri Krishna, he preached the same doctrine. There is a variation in certain outward forms and names which do not matter, but the teaching itself has ever been the same. Yet although men have always been told, have always known what was God's will, it is very hard to get them to do it. 750. We read much of the simple life. The simplest lives of all one suppose were led by the hermits of old, are led even today in India by people who go forth into the jungle absolutely without anything, and devote themselves entirely to following the higher life. I am well aware that often deteriorates some of them, and those who are supposed to be devoting themselves to the higher life are sometimes in reality not yet able fully to do so. Are not yet at the level where they can spend a whole life in meditation. Thus there are yogis who have caused yoga to be criticized, and hermits who have brought disgrace upon the religion for which they are working. Still, the fact remains that the highest and simplest life of all is in reality the fullest life, the life which is lived wholly upon higher planes. 751. That is not for all, most of us are on the line of karma yoga, or active service. Our business is to work for the benefit of the world on the physical plane. The man who retires from the world should be working for it far more decidedly and strongly, but at the higher level. He does not retire to meditate in a jungle or a cave merely because he wants to get away from the rest of the world and save his own soul more easily in that way. He goes because, being already a soul which is saved, radiant, rejoicing, strong, a spiritual power, he feels that he can do greater work on higher planes than he could in a city, amid interferences from the physical plane. 11 Anti, Volume I, Part 5, Ch. 2, Love in Daily Life, Ch. 6, Service, Volume I, page 74. 752. Sometimes men have retired to the jungle merely to avoid the responsibilities and difficulties of worldly duty. But the man who has transcended worldly duty will find that it will fade away from him, and when the way thus opens up for him, he may permit himself to try the higher life of the sannyasi or monk. Yet even then in this period of the world's history that monastic life does not seem to be the way generally indicated. There is so much to do in the world that at least we must fulfill all our duties there before we may feel ourselves at liberty to retire from it and leave that work to others. It may be that when the great world teacher comes he will choose those who are to work upon these different lines. It may well be that among those who are young some may be chosen to lead the life of the monk. We do not know. But it is quite certain that he will need loving, active, willing helpers on the physical plane. For the moment let us do that work, because that comes to our hand to do. If when he comes he chooses to draw some of us away to do some higher work, then he will give us the power to do it, but for the moment let us do that, which is obviously our duty, and do it with all our might as unto the Lord and not unto men. 753:6. Store in your memory the melody you hear. 754. Only fragments of the great song come to your ears while yet you are but man. But if you listen to it, remember it faithfully, so that none which has reached you is lost, and endeavor to learn from it the meaning of the mystery which surrounds you. In time you will need no teacher. For as the individual has voice, so has that in which the individual exists. 755. If you listen you will hear the great song sometimes, then remember it and never forget what you have heard, so that nothing that has reached you may be lost. In that way, by piecing together the fragments of the great song you may gradually learn from it the meaning of the mystery that surrounds you. 756. Life is a mystery to those who do not see it as a whole, and none of us can see it fully until we become one with the logos of the system, the logos of whom all this life is the expression. Only he can see it fully. We, as minute fragments, I know that is not philosophical, but it comes nearer to the fact than any other expression, I think, as tiny parts of his consciousness, may identify ourselves to a greater or less extent with that great consciousness. And just in proportion as we do so shall we be able to see this, to sense it, to know it. Each one of us who is trying to hear the song of life is trying to piece together the fragments which he sees here and there. 757. Probably the whole of nature is the expression of something which is simple, a very few simple forces under different conditions account for all we see around us. But we are not yet in a position to see exactly what these forces are and how the conditions work. 1 Anti, pages 162-3. It seems at first strange, therefore, that the further we inquire in a scientific way into nature the greater is the complexity we find. You put on higher and higher powers to your microscope, for example, and you find that what seemed only a simple little speck is in reality a wonderfully complex organism. Until recently chemists used to think of an element, such as gold or iron, as a simple thing, but years ago, by clairvoyant sight, which goes far beyond the power of the microscope, we saw that it was a most complex object. We saw, for example, that what is commonly called a chemical atom of gold contains 3,546 of the ultimate physical atoms. And that they are moving in groups round their own center of gravity in close imitation of the solar system. 758. So it would appear that the more deeply we investigate the more complex we find everything. Yet ultimately that is not true, because if we go further and further still we at last find that all is built of bubbles in Koilan, built of nothing, and the whole material universe is in a way an illusion. Indeed, the Indian books told us this, long ago, that there is an ultimate simplicity behind all the complexity. We cannot speak with certainty because as yet we have not seen it. But it seems so probable that we may almost take it as a certainty that that same rule will hold good everywhere, that while the complexities are quite infinitely greater than we have thought them to be, yet behind all that lies absolute simplicity. 759. 7. Learn from it the lesson of harmony. 760. You can stand upright now, firm as a rock amid the turmoil, obeying the warrior who is thyself and thy king. Unconcerned in the battle save to do his bidding, having no longer any care as to the result of the battle, for one thing only is important, that the warrior shall win, and you know he is incapable of defeat, standing thus, cool and awakened. Use the hearing you have acquired by pain and by the destruction of pain. 761. The great Venetian master is describing here the state at which the man ought to have arrived when the higher self is the warrior, the one who fights. When the man recognizes that he is that warrior in truth, that he is that higher self, and that it is divine and within the logos, then he becomes unconcerned as to the battle of life, except to do the bidding of that higher self. 762. At first in our struggle in the world, in our endeavor to do our work and fulfill our duties, we are very much concerned about the result. We feel that unless we are able to work for it, the right will not win. The right will always win in the end. It would be sad that any one of us should fail to do his part toward securing that end, but we may be sure that whatever is done, the right must eventually triumph, and so long as we do the bidding of the higher self. So long as we are making our utmost effort, the fact that that utmost effort appears to fail should not trouble or concern us. But we must be very sure that we are making the utmost effort and that we are not using the certainty that the right will win as an excuse for laziness. 763. Thousands of people said with regard to the Great War, "Oh well, the right will win. Why should we do anything?" Yes, the right did win, but it was a very sad thing for those who, having had the opportunity to help, deliberately refused. On them lies the karma of a great opportunity lost, and also the karma of all the additional evil that happened because of the delay. If more people had come forward boldly and been willing to sacrifice themselves, the right would have won much sooner and many lives would have been saved. Those who hung back were responsible for the lives of the additional people who had to die. I suppose there are many people, though it seems hard to believe it, who would rather send someone else to die for them than die themselves. It is a low stage in evolution, but there are those, apparently. 764. It is absolutely certain that in the great struggle of life the right will win, and also that all will evolve to perfection some day, somehow, not perhaps in this chain of worlds but in some other. Yet those who take that as an excuse for laziness, and say, "All will come out well, I need not exert myself," the ego will fight somewhere on some higher level. It does not matter what I, as a personality, do, will be making very sad karma for themselves, because they are delaying the final triumph of good in this cycle of evolution. 765. There is a great difference between knowing that the warrior within you must win, and the stage before that when you do not know for certain. In the latter case you feel only vaguely that he must win, and you are very much concerned about your part in the battle. This is a necessary stage, even though it is a mistake. But he who certainly knows attains to perfect calm even in the midst of failure, not the calm of inactivity, but of the divine will in the higher self. From the point of view of the great consummation, no one's work is insignificant. All the little efforts taken together make the mighty whole, but yet each man's part in it is so small a part that he must not be unduly proud with regard to it. The right must win, but the question is whether we are going to form part of this conquering host now or whether we are to be one of those who are to be left. We must be among either the lifters or the lifted. Each man must be one of those who are working for the world, or one of those for whom the work is being done. 766. The real self will win, it is incapable of defeat. When the personality is thrown off and the warrior within the man fights, he must win. When you have identified yourself fully with him, you stand cool and awakened, and you watch the contest in which you are taking part precisely as though you were not taking part in it. You try through it all to listen to that song of life. You use that hearing which you have acquired by pain and by the destruction of pain. So long as you have the pain, and feel it as such, you are still fighting, you are only on the way. But by the destruction of that you come into that state in which you have another sense, as it were, which enables you to hear and to see all the while what it is that lies behind. Amidst all the turmoil and the strife you hear the song of life. Amidst the wild confusion you see the mighty current. You have come to know that this pain is only a temporary thing, you pass beyond it so that it is no longer woe to you, it is no longer suffering. You know its meaning, and its power to hurt you is therefore dead. Chapter 4. Rules 9-12. 767, CWL, we come now to the group of rules 9-12. Once more we may put together each of the short rules with that portion of the Chohan's comment which goes with it. 768, 9. Regard earnestly all the life that surrounds you. 769, regard the constantly changing and moving life which surrounds you, for it is formed by the hearts of men. And as you learn to understand their constitution and meaning, you will by degrees be able to read the larger word of life. 770, most people spend their time regarding not the life but the form which surrounds them. They do not dwell to any extent upon the thought of the indwelling life. That is why they can be so rough and careless about vegetation, cutting down beautiful trees, and turning a delightful countryside into a dreadful manufacturing center or an ugly city, without a thought for the preservation of as much natural beauty as possible at the same time. That is also why they can be so incredibly callous in their dealings with our younger brothers of the animal kingdom, and even with one another. 771. It is also the reason why the evil in the world weighs so heavily upon the feelings of the better kind of people. If they looked beneath the surface of things and saw what is happening to the indwelling life, and how even the most distressing events are used to assist the life on its road to divine happiness, they would be less troubled. The disciple must turn his attention to the life in everything. The first thing to recognize in all life is that it is an expression of the Logos himself. It is true that in much of the life around us we find many things that are repellent, things which we know as evil, and yet they too bear their part in the progress of the world. And because of that we may look everywhere for the manifestation of the deity himself. 772. There is always some human good in every person, except, perhaps, in the case of a personality that has definitely broken away from the higher self. That is a thing which sometimes happens, though very rarely indeed. It sounds dreadful, and so it is, but it has been grossly exaggerated. The idea of what used to be called the lost soul was harped upon a great deal in early theosophical literature, and 2 or 3 statements referring to quite different conditions were sometimes all taken together. And the mixture misled a number of people, making them think that lost souls were quite numerous. 773. There is a certain set of people in the world who are intensely attracted to anything gruesome. They always want to make the worst of anything and everything. This is quite strongly marked in the lower classes in England. One would judge from the fare that is provided by the newspapers that it is common also elsewhere. If they have bad news to tell, they seem to take a delight in telling it as vividly as possible, and adding numerous gruesome details to the tale. I suppose many people possess that temperament in varying degrees, and it is not confined to the lower classes, though it comes out very crudely in them. 774. I believe that we had in a theosophical society some people who were somewhat of that temperament, and they picked out very carefully all the references to subjects of this sort, to the 8th sphere and the possible loss of the soul, and wove out of them all a terrible story. Then they confused with that the remark of Madame Blavatsky's that we are elbowing lost souls by millions every day in the street. That is a statement which in any case would require a certain amount of modification. To elbow 1,000,000 people would take one rather more than a day. It is not an idea which can be taken literally, but is a picturesque way of speaking of the 2/5 of humanity who will drop out of our evolution in the middle of the 5th round. They can be described as lost souls only as distinguished from those who will pass on safely. 775. They will be lost to this particular chain of worlds, but as has been explained, there is no eternal punishment for them. They will rest in drowsy contentment and be quite happy because they do not know anything better. They are not in the least to be pitied, unless it be because they will have another long cycle of lives to live in the next chain of worlds, and that is tiresome, as we all know. For those to whom it comes it is the best thing, far better and easier and pleasanter than it would be for them to remain in our evolution, when they are not fitted for it, and thus to be pushed on at the cost of very considerable strain, which would probably eventually break them down altogether. They have not wasted their time, because all that they have learned and acquired in this particular chain of worlds will stand to their credit and there is some progress for them in their interchain devotion. They will therefore take a high place in the next chain of worlds, because they will begin in advance of the new egos of that chain. 776. Those, then, are the millions whom we jostle. That has nothing to do with the isolated cases in which the personality breaks away from the individuality. That is a dreadful thing, but it is very much better to regard it not as a colossal catastrophe, but only as an exaggerated case of something that is constantly happening, for, as I have explained, 1 Anti, Volume 2, page 284. At the end of each incarnation something is usually lost, though much may also have been gained. The loss of an entire personality would imply a life of most dreadful evil. Even then the ego does no evil intentionally, but he sometimes lets his personality get out of hand. He is responsible for that, he should not have allowed it, though that for which he is responsible is weakness rather than direct evil. Still, the ego of the man is going on. It has fallen back very terribly, but it does start afresh, though perhaps not immediately, because it seems to be stunned at first. After such an experience an ego would always be peculiar. He would always be dissatisfied, and would have recollections of something higher and greater which now he could not reach. It is a fearful condition, but still the man who casts himself so far back as that has to take the karma of it, and realize ultimately that he has brought it upon himself. 777. I do not know for certain what further possibilities of loss there may have been in earlier days of the world's history. As things stand now it seems quite certain that the very worst that can happen to any ego is that he shall lose the whole of one personality. That is a serious matter indeed, and might throw him back from a fairly advanced civilization into almost a savage condition, but it could not now throw him back into the animal world. I am not prepared to say that there may not have been a time when it could have done even that, but it is not possible now, so far as we can see. 778. It is not so very long ago, as occultists consider time, since a great many of our present humanity left the animal state. When the time of the shutting of the door from the animal to the human kingdom was drawing near, a great effort was made to get as many through as possible, to give the very last chance to every one. The Lords of the Flame came down from Venus expressly to stimulate things just at that period or a little before it, and all the efforts that were put forth then were chiefly with that aim in view. To give the opportunity to as many as possible to make the change from the animal to the human kingdom before the door was finally closed. Just as in infinitely smaller matters people make a special effort, when there is a big chance opening before them, whether it be to go to a bargain sale at a shop, or to pass an examination. So there seems to have been something of the same kind on an infinitely vaster scale, at the time of the last opportunity of leaving the animal kingdom and entering into the human in this particular incarnation of our chain of worlds. 779. There must then have been many who were not so very much above the animal kingdom, who only just scraped through. Several hundred of the incarnations of such people must have been spent in quite the lowest kind of savage condition, and with hardly any interval between them. They were practically in physical life all the time and only very gradually developed any astral possibilities. There may have been some of those who might almost as well not have got through, and at least such as those will be practically certain to drop out in the middle of the 5th round. Still they will have had a considerable experience of human life, from the middle of the 4th to the middle of the 5th round, so in the next chain of worlds they will come in not quite at the beginning. They will have passed through the primary classes and will be able to start again as very decent savages. People as low as they could not do anything to throw themselves very far back in evolution. They have not the power to make much progress, their advance must necessarily be slow, but on the other hand they have so little brain power that they could not throw themselves very far back. 780. Much is said in some ancient scriptures about people sinking back into the animal kingdom. We have no direct evidence of any cases. There are other ways in which men may come into touch with animal consciousness and suffer very terribly through it, as I have explained in the Inner Life, 1 op. Cit. Volume 2, Section 1, but to reincarnate as an animal is not possible now. We are now too far removed from the dividing line to be able to throw ourselves back across it, whatever may have been possible in the distant past. Not even the most determined black magicians can do it. We saw something of those beings in activity during the Great War, because some of the lords of the dark face of Atlantis came back into incarnation. That accounted for many of the horrors that took place. The karma which those people made for themselves was unquestionably ghastly. I have once or twice seen glimpses of the future karma of people who were much less guilty than some of those. It is a sight one does not forget, a hideous nightmare. There are people far short of these great meteors of crime who yet lay up for themselves futures of horror, those who beat children, and those who vivisect animals. At their future one looks with a shudder, but these are far worse. These have done the same thing on a colossal scale, and for insane selfishness have sacrificed half a world. Yet they do not become animals. In those rare cases in which a personality has broken away, it lives a life somewhat like that of Margrave in Bulwer Lytton's A Strange Story, the absolutely selfish man, without conscience, without a soul behind to guide him. He will be a terribly evil man, and may carry on his evil to a second incarnation. It was stated by Madame Blavatsky that such a personality may in some cases take another incarnation by seizing upon a baby body. There is no body provided for him, but he may seize upon that of some child who has just died, and revivify it and live in it, and so gain a second life. She spoke very little of these subjects, but when she did allude to them it was with a lively horror impressive to see. It was clear to us who heard her that she had herself at some time been brought into contact with cases of this kind, because she shrank from speaking of them at all. 781. We understood from what she said that a second human reincarnation for such a thing was not possible, but that it might happen that this decaying personality, which still had a certain amount of the ego torn away and vivifying it, might then descend into the animal kingdom. She told us once a very ghastly story indeed of the way in which such a thing, still consciousness, might drift backwards in what she called devolution. She said, I remember, that some snakes were inhabited by such entities as these, and that some of these things were conscious that they had once been human. It is a horrible thing, it sounds a kind of nightmare, but we may be comforted by the fact that it is an exceptionally rare thing, that such a condition could be reached only by a determined devotion of life after life to positive evil. 782. We have only a sprinkling of really wicked people in the world, and even they mostly excuse themselves in some way. The burglar who steals your plate has generally some theory that property is improperly distributed, and that he is only taking the share which the government or someone else ought to have given him. That he is taking it from somebody who is unfairly in possession of a quantity of wealth which really ought to be distributed to all. People very rarely do a wrong thing knowing it to be wrong. They always excuse themselves in some way. They may see afterwards that the excuse was rather flimsy, but I believe that at the time when a man does the wrong thing he practically always justifies himself somehow. Much more than that is needed in order to attain to the horrors of being a lost soul. The man must devote himself quite definitely and intentionally to doing evil, must set himself against the current of evolution. 783. Such hideous possibilities are becoming rarer, humanity is making progress and gaining more and more knowledge, and it becomes less and less possible as time goes on for people of the dark side to obtain recruits. Even now they are really relics of the past. We have heard much of vampires and werewolves, such creatures did exist and still are occasionally found. I have seen examples of both, but do not expect to see any more. It is becoming less possible that men should be able to sink into those depths. Instead of becoming vampires, people now fall into the grey world. That is a condition which we have apparently introduced instead of vampirism. It is better, certainly, though it is bad enough. 784. Life in the grey world after death is due to the entanglement of the astral body with the etheric double. 1 ante, page 321. There are people who have no clear belief in life beyond death, who yet hunger for continued existence. They would vaguely tell you that they believed in an after state, but it amounts in reality to a very strong doubt. As no life but the physical means anything to them, they cling desperately to the physical body, so much so that after death the etheric matter cannot be fully drawn away from the dense physical matter, as it is in normal cases. Then you have a person for quite a long time after death in a condition which is neither one world or the other. He retains an amount of etheric matter which prevents him from using his astral senses fully, so that he does not, as he should, slip into the astral world, and on the other hand he cannot keep hold of the physical world. Because he has lost his grasp of that, though there is still some of the etheric matter left round him. Thus he is suspended in what is sometimes called the grey world. In this condition he obtains only little glimpses, occasional impressions of each world, but he is in a very unsettled condition, struggling always to obtain full life somewhere. All that might fall from him in a single moment if he would let it, but often it is a long time before he can do so. 785, the Chohan says that the changing life about us is formed by the hearts of men. It is true that our outward conditions result from our inward thoughts and feelings. Sometimes people complain about the state of society, government, politics, religion, trade and education, but these very well express the inner condition of the people who swarm in our cities. It is all formed by the hearts of men. And even the less immediately caused human conditions of suffering and joy, such as geological and climatic changes, even such as earthquakes and floods, become our environment on account of karma which is due to our own feeling and thinking. We thus put ourselves into our place in nature, according to our inward nature, our hearts, and then we are apt to misunderstand it because we look at the forms instead of at the life. 786. A great deal of what seems to most men actively evil may yet have its good side. A physical plain example of this world be a terrible earthquake, like that which devastated a great part of Sicily and Calabria in 1908, and killed over 150,000 people, some suddenly, but others, I am afraid, with a great deal of suffering. Many people would look upon that as an evil. It is not evil for the world. It upheaves and changes the place of a great deal of the earth's crust, and renovates the soil, and in that it distinctly does good to the world. Look at Mount Vesuvius, in Italy, and you will see how after a certain time all the volcanic matter which is thrown out becomes the very finest fertile soil. But it destroys human life at the time. A thunderstorm, an earthquake, a great flood, are not evil at all. They may release some men from their physical bodies, but surely that does no harm to them, in any case. All that arises in such catastrophes is a matter of karma, and in the long run it assuredly works out for their good. 787. The theosophist ought to understand quite clearly that death is not in itself an evil, but is very often given as a reward. Our general attitude in this matter is due to wrong religious teaching. There is implanted in every one of us the desire for self-preservation, the instinct to try to save our physical body from injury or destruction. That is a very wise and necessary instinct. We ought to protect our physical bodies, to make them last as long as we can. Because, if one may venture to express it so with all reverence, the Logos has taken the trouble to put us into this incarnation, it is clearly our duty to make of it as much as we can. 11 Ante, page 177. 788. But there sometimes comes an opportunity when the very noblest use that we can make of our incarnation is to risk it, even to throw it away, as happens to a soldier who goes forth on a forlorn hope, knowing that he must be killed. And yet that his death is a necessary part of a great scheme which will end in victory. Such a man puts his incarnation to the noblest use when he lays it down voluntarily, when he throws it away. But for most of us and under ordinary conditions our duty is to take all reasonable precautions, and try to make our bodies last as long as we can, otherwise we cause a great deal of trouble by shortening our lives. 789. Some people have been a little foolish in their confidence in the protection which they expect the masters to give to them. They say, as long as I do the master's work I need not take any precautions against infection when I visit people who are ill. I am sure he will take care of me. I will plunge into the water although I cannot swim, I am sure he will support me. Perhaps he will, if he thinks it worth while, but what right has anyone to put him to the trouble of doing that which with a little ordinary common sense he might have done for himself? If it be our work to visit those suffering from infectious diseases, I think instead of blindly trusting to the master to protect us, we ought to save him trouble by taking ordinary precautions. We ought to do all we can on our side. If he chooses to supplement that, it is his affair. It would be very wrong of us to calculate upon it beforehand. Such interventions do happen, but we have no right to expect them. I have seen strange things myself along those lines, but I should never willingly put the master to the trouble of having especially to protect me against anything, when I can reasonably guard myself. 790. The instinct of self-preservation is for the advantage of the race. It is a right thing, but the brave man is always ready to risk pain and danger and even life itself for higher objects. The man who knows that death is not the greatest evil will be very willing to risk it for the sake of averting a greater evil, just what hundreds of thousands of our fellow men did in the war. We know that death is not the end of everything, as people so often think, and for us a catastrophe like that of Messina is not terrible simply because a large number of people were suddenly thrown out of their bodies on to the astral plane. When I was in America there was a great fire in a theater in Chicago, in which a large number of women and children were killed. Some of our members came to me and asked, how can it be that Providence really governs the world, when all these innocent women and children have been killed? I said to them, do you think that only men ever deserve the reward of a rapid release from the earth? That was a new point of view to them, that this might really be a kindness releasing them from troublesome conditions of various kinds, so that they might start again in better circumstances. So we should not regard that great earthquake as an evil, merely because it suddenly threw a number of people on to the astral plane. The cases of those who were imprisoned and died slowly were comparatively few. There were some who were burned to death, and some who were buried among the ruins. Those would seem to us cases of very terrible suffering. But even then we must apply our theosophy in the extreme cases as well as in the ordinary cases and realize that the great suffering of an occasional individual probably wiped out from his account karma which might have taken 20 ordinary lives to cancel. Therefore, while we should feel the greatest pity for the people who suffered in that way, and should do all in our power to help them, still we are not to mourn over them as though the whole thing were useless. It is a short but drastic way of getting rid of the result of a great deal of evil, truly terrible, but yet, when it is over, see how much has been gained. 791. We have compared painful experiences roughly, it is not wise to press an analogy too far, to the slow natural curing of some serious disease in one case, and the curing of it in another case by a surgical operation. The surgical operation is dreadful to pass through but when it is over the trouble ought to be done with. A slow cure might mean in the aggregate even more suffering, distributed over many years. I suppose we must take terrible pieces of karma as karmic surgical operations. We do not sympathize, in the ordinary sense of the word, with the dead, because we know that they are far better off than before. With the relations who mourn their loss we do sympathize. But even then let us correct the mistake which causes people to feel horror at these things, and to think that God can no longer be good since he permits them. The experiences are terrible indeed but the result of the whole process is invariably good. 792. We must rise altogether above personal points of view to see how all is working together for good, and how the life in others is threading its way through the maze of karma to the feet of the eternal. The Chohan says we must read the larger word, take the larger view, of life. Doing this, we shall never classify people in the smaller way. We shall not, for example, think of religious men merely as churchmen and dissenters, but as devotional men. So also we shall think of statesmen not merely as tones or radicals. We shall take wider views, and regard our fellows as men of thought, or of love or of will, according to the type of human conscious activity that dominates their lives. We shall qualify them according to their rays. Adopting this deeper classification, we get nearer to the heart of reality, and find ourselves better able to understand life. 793. It is very difficult to understand fully all the different types, but we should try to do so. The adept does understand quite fully, and sympathizes with every possible type, but it takes an adept to do that. Our duty is to try. However impossible the point of view of the other man may seem at first, one must try to understand it. This does not for a moment mean that one must adopt his outlook. We have just as much right to our own point of view as this other man has to his, but he has also just as much right to his standpoint as we have to ours. A man who can sympathize with those who entirely and radically differ from himself has already made a considerable step towards understanding at least a section of the world in which he lives. 794. It is very clear that what the Master says here is a definite command for the disciple. We must learn to understand every type of person as fully as we can. And whenever we can use influence in any way to get people out of their ruts, that is a good thing to do. It must always be done with understanding, however, for sometimes we may not be able to get a person out on our side of the rut. We may actually throw him into a less desirable condition by what we teach him. I have known that to happen. 795. Those whose memories go back to the older theosophical literature will perhaps remember that it was not very sympathetic to the Church. Madame Blavatsky herself was a little impatient of the orthodox presentation of religion. She had evidently seen a very great deal of the effect of ignorant religious belief in cramping the minds and souls of the people, and sometimes she made quite a severe attack against the narrow religious beliefs that were taught. I think she did not always stop to tell people that there was another and higher side to it all. She was a deadly foe to superstition in any and every form, and she was more concerned in shaking the people out of their superstitions than with providing them with anything else. Probably those people needed just that shaking out, and required to be treated in that drastic way. Probably they could not have been brought immediately to our outlook on life. 796. I knew Dr. Bezanт when her attacks on Christianity were even more slashing than Madame Blavatsky's. She would address large numbers of free thinkers in the Hall of Science in London, and when they had a Christian evidence man or a clergyman defending orthodoxy, it was interesting to listen to her. For she was probably the greatest debater of the time. I have heard her debate before and after she came into theosophy. The theosophical debate was much more charitable than the previous type, but it was not nearly as interesting. She pointed out very gently and kindly the weak points of the other side, and dropped inconvenient questions as much as she could, out of consideration for the feelings of the other party. When first I heard her debate she pushed her advantage to the full, and made it much more interesting, though not pleasantly so for her opponent. 797. Her power is just as great today, but she uses it so much more mercifully that one does not see it in debate to anything like the same extent. She has now what perhaps in her free-thought days she had not, this faculty of understanding everybody. She has that very wonderful power, but she has acquired it by definite work. She has grown into it by making herself understand other people and by putting herself in their places. In her free-thought days, when I first heard her debate, she certainly did not put herself in the place of her opponent, whom she sometimes reduced to stuttering imbecility by the faultless logic and the violence of her attacks. 798. The man who wants to understand all, who wants fully to learn this larger view of life, must also identify himself with the lower kingdoms, must understand nature as a whole as far as he can. He must enter into a sympathetic attitude towards the great devas, the nature spirits, the spirits of the trees and of the countryside. We seem to have lost that in these modern civilizations, though here and there we find a poet, an author, or an artist who has it. Because they had it, such men as Ruskin and Turner could write and paint as they did. 799. In ancient Greece we looked at things very differently from the way in which people regard them now. Everything in nature meant much more to us then than it does in these days, except to the few who are artistic. We thought less about money and business, and we enjoyed nature more. It is well to understand such a point of view as that. In the development of the lower mind, and in sharpening it on the business and practical side of life, our modern races have lost very much. Though unquestionably they have also gained a great deal, the faculty of managing a great many things at once, and also that of concentration under exceedingly difficult circumstances, amid the fearful noise and racket and tear of this civilization. We had nothing like that in Greece. We could not travel about so quickly, but we saw very much more when we did travel. 800. I think we should try to recover the ancient outlook to some extent, by entering into the life and glory and beauty of the world which is all around us. The surroundings that man makes in these times are rarely beautiful, but in the days when men understood nature more, they did not spoil her forms nearly so much. The Greeks could build temples which were not out of place amidst the most beautiful natural surroundings. Perhaps we also will learn to combine beauty with usefulness. For example, we may learn to erect a building like a cathedral to be used as a factory. But in the meantime it is one of the weak points in this civilization that it is out of sympathy with nature in all her deeper aspects, so that we need cultivation to acquire what was inborn in the Greeks, sympathy with nature. When one reads Ruskin's Queen of the Air one begins to understand a little of it. 801. Let us try to make all-round progress. We have all lived in races of the past which made beauty their principal influence, which had leisure and largeness of life. We, therefore, have it all in the ego. Our present life crushes it down to a great extent, but it needs only to be appealed to, and it will break through the barrier. That can be done, and it is worth doing even if only from a selfish point of view, for we should then enjoy life far more fully. 802. There are some people who feel disharmony with nature, who say that we are surrounded by evil influences, and that the world is full of scorpions and snakes and tigers. There is no inherent wickedness in a snake or a scorpion or a hornet, but they are all exceedingly easily irritated, and entirely, as we should say if they were human, unscrupulous as to the methods they employ. They simply run amok, and sting or bite everyone nearby, if they happen to be a little annoyed, but you cannot call them wicked creatures, because they are not doing this with malignity. They are very full of life, so they plunge about and injure anyone who happens to come in their way. 803. It is the same in the astral and etheric regions as well. There are plenty of the lower types of nature spirits who are not wicked, not seeking to do evil, but are very unpleasant creatures to deal with, the sort to be avoided. Fortunately it is easier to avoid these things on the astral plane than in the physical world, because a strong wish is sufficient there to drive them away from you. Creatures of that sort will take advantage of you if you lay yourself open to their influence. Many of them, as I have before explained, are delighted to find a man in a royal rage. They do not in the least care why he is angry. I am not at all sure that they know that a man is involved, but when they find a vortex of vivid coarse vibrations which happen to suit them they plunge in and enjoy it and stimulate it. And in every possible way make more and more of it. 804. Vibrations of cruelty are greatly enjoyed by some of these creatures, and there is no doubt that they are eager to seize upon one who has this vice, and stir him up to greater cruelty than the man himself would ever have thought of. If you let anger take hold of you, you may do and say all kinds of things you would not wish to do in the least. The same is true of cruelty, certainly it is also true of jealousy, envy and hatred. When a man plunges into any one of these passions, it is as though the astral body suddenly became alive and vindictive, because it is seized upon by a quantity of these creatures. It is very difficult for us to feel at all kindly towards them. We naturally think of the bad effect that they produce upon us. Yet the poor thing is only enjoying himself after his kind. That does not, however, excuse our letting him get hold of us. We ought to have risen above it. But we have to remember that all kinds of intensifications of that sort do take place, and when we are studying our fellow men we must constantly make allowances for them. 805. There are vast forces moving round us of which most men have very little idea. We all know that in a general sort of way. We know that forces such as public opinion press upon us without our feeling them, but we do not quite realize, perhaps, the tremendous strength of the law of evolution and the many and diverse ways in which it is acting all about us. God hides himself in matter, but he is not dead because he hides himself there. All the time his activities, his forces, are playing upon all his creatures. When they are acting strongly on a man they stir him up, and that is somewhat like the stirring up of a pool. All the water is put into motion, and whatever there is in the pool is churned up and brought to the surface. The pool may become very muddy for the time being by the process, but by it one learns what was lying at the bottom. It is better that the water should be stirred up, even if there is mud, than to let it stagnate and go hopelessly to the bad. So sometimes all this disturbance which is a part of his divine life brings out in people qualities which are undesirable. 806. It might be suggested that it would be better for a person if he had not been stirred up, but that is not so. He has for the time being been made more alive, disagreeably so, but it is better that the unpleasant qualities should come to the surface. Then he will know of them, and his friends, who see them too, may help him. Whereas otherwise they might remain unnoticed, and might produce seriously bad effects when an opportunity occurred for their being stirred up later on. So sometimes it is the very divine force itself which brings forth activities which seem undesirable. We may be very sure that he who doeth all things well. He knows what he is doing, and when he stirs up foul matter of some kind it is in order that it should be expelled, though at the time it does not always look well or hopeful for evolution. We have constantly to remember that every man we see is on a different rung of the ladder of evolution, so that what for one is very good, even necessary, is precisely that which would be harmful for another. We have to watch, and learn how to be entirely impartial and not to judge hastily, whatever happens. All lives are in the Logos and are quite definitely part of his life, so it follows that all these things are really his aspects and expressions. In that way we have kinship with all these manifestations, and a duty towards them. We may have opportunities of helping one and not another, we must take what comes in our way to do. 807:10. Learn to look intelligently into the hearts of men. 808. Study the hearts of men that you may know what is that world in which you live and of which you will to be a part. 809. In this rule the word heart is used symbolically. We must look into the whole nature of man as far as we can, not only into his feelings, which are usually represented by the heart, but into his mental processes as well. We are required to try to understand him deeply, and to do that we must search for the manifestation of the ego in him. 810. When we see men round us acting in ways different from our own we often exclaim, whatever could have made the man do such a thing as that? We could not conceive of ourselves doing that particular thing under any circumstances, and we cannot see why our fellow man should do it. Most of us have rather given up many such riddles long ago, because they seem almost impossible to understand. I cannot understand, for example, why huge crowds should go to see a boxing match. I cannot see what is the interest in it, because to me the whole thing is a brutal exhibition. If it were a question of paying, I should prefer to pay to go away somewhere not to see it. If I think over it carefully and try to reason it out, I find that perhaps the attraction is an exhibition of skill, of a certain brutal and degraded sort. But nevertheless it is skill, and perhaps there is also the idea of courage and staying power. 811. In the same way numbers of people stand about the corners of the streets, guffawing and talking in coarse and raucous voices. What pleasure they get out of it I do not understand in the very least. Still, there they are, and they constitute a large section of human beings, whom we ought more or less to try to understand. 812. People do all kinds of strange things. Sometimes they fail into ecstasies of jealousy over nothing in particular. At others, one sees people acutely affected by what somebody else says about them. You apply reason, and say that it does not in the very least matter what other people say, because it does not do them any harm. But the fact remains that they are very strongly and seriously affected. We ought to understand why, to some extent, if we can. I quite admit it is out of the question in many cases, still manifestly it is our business to try to understand our fellow men. 813. Some people might say that it is sought an interesting study. It is not interesting for us personally, if we are thinking about that, but it is interesting from the larger point of view. Since we think of ourselves as having evolved a little further than these people, it is very clearly our duty to help them, but without understanding our help will be futile. It is very true that the things in which most of these people are interested do not interest us, but that is only a symptom of our having grown a little beyond them in the age of the soul. The soul grows, and people become more rational as they advance. Small children do all sorts of things that we cannot understand. Boys and girls of 13 or 14 have a set of motives which are somewhat nearer to ours, but still we do not know why they do what they do. We have to go back to our own youth before we can realize at all what they are doing and how things will strike them. It is always difficult, I know that well, because I have had very much to do at one time and another with boys and young people. If you put an idea before them in a certain way, in the hope that they may perhaps take it as you take it, sometimes they do, but often they approach it from quite another point of view. and decide upon it for reasons which would never have occurred to you. Sometimes you can make out what they are aiming at, but sometimes you cannot. Schoolmasters and other people who have much to do with boys and girls ought to make it part of their business to try to understand their bizarre lines of thought and feeling, because then they are more likely to avoid offending the young people. 8:14, that is an extreme case, but you have to do the same thing with the adult people round you. If you are desirous to help them, you must try to put yourself in their place. That is what is meant here by learning to look intelligently into the hearts of men. They have their prejudices and you have yours. It is highly probable that the prejudices are different in some ways, and so you have to discover the other person's point of view and make allowance for it. Endeavor to find how he arrives at his position and why his particular prejudice exists, so that perhaps you may be able to help him to surmount it. 8:15, prejudice is indeed very subtle. It is so strong and so ingrained generally that the man does not know it is there, he does not believe that he requires any help, and it is therefore often difficult to give it without offense. Still, it is a very great advantage to a man if he can be helped somehow to get rid of his prejudice. In order to succeed in that work and do it skillfully, you must find out just why the man thinks this or that, and how his prejudice arose. Your own prejudice in the matter will have to be put aside resolutely, otherwise you will be dragging him from one false point of view to another. 8:16, most of the causes of people's strange interests arise in their astral bodies. The mental body is only in process of being developed. This fact can be seen in all the phenomena that surround us in the mental plane after death. When the average better-class man passes into the astral world, he is fully capable of taking an intelligent part in the life of that plane, though some do and some do not, and some soon get the matter of their bodies rearranged, and thereby become greatly limited in capacity. The astral body has its faculties well developed, they are ready for use, though many people do not know what they ought to do and how they ought to use them. When those who have made some study of these matters pass to the astral plane, they find themselves in a vehicle which expresses them more fully than did the physical body, but when they reach the heaven world it is generally not so. 817. There we usually find them working inside the mental body, and so very much shut up in it that it is really more of a shell for them than an expression of their life. That is what is meant by all that is written so strongly in the older books as to the fact that men in the heaven world are shut away from all the rest. It is often spoken of as though it were a reserved part of the mental plane. It is not that, but each man has shut himself up in his own shell, and therefore he takes no part in the life of the mental plane at all. He does not move about freely and deal with people as he does in the astral plane. The only openings in his shell through which life outside can reach him are those windows which he has made for himself by developing his mental body on certain lines. Whatever the man has done with his mental body lays him open to mental influences. Whatever it is, he will reap the result during his heaven life, and he can to some extent communicate with the outside world through that. But the results which he will be able to produce upon the inhabitants of that plane will be much less on the whole than those which they will produce upon him. Because it is often only through very narrow channels that he is able to express himself at all on that plane. 818, that very fact, which for a long time in the earlier days of our theosophical study we did not understand, shows that the mental body of the average man is only partially developed. When we come to look at the manifestations down here in the physical world, we find that the same thing is true. Probably everyone has experienced these limitations in other people. We can find them in ourselves if we wish, but we see these things more readily in others than in ourselves. When you talk to strangers about theosophy, for example, you will find that some of them take it up with great eagerness, and others do not know what you are talking about. They listen to what you say, and they say, "Yes, yes," but they are obviously not interested. The usual reason for this difference between people is that some of them have met ideas of this sort in previous lives and others have not. I think we should be justified in considering that all people who have been civilized for some thousands of years have certainly met with these ideas in earlier lives. Anyone who had a birth in ancient India or ancient Egypt, or who was sufficiently respectable to enter the mysteries in Greece or Rome, will already have had some touch with these ideas. Some will have gone deeply into the matter, and by doing so will have developed that part of their mental bodies which is able to think of ideas such as these. Others cannot understand, and they do not care about it. All they want is to have a good time, as they put it. Apart from these grosser and lower desires, their brains are of no use to them. If you could get them to read a page about theosophy, they would not remember it. 819. The brain must be educated along the line in which we want it to work, and that is precisely what we do in theosophy. Those people who take it up readily and eagerly do so partly because it answers many questions which they have been asking themselves, and partly because they have thought to some extent along such lines in other lives. Their brains are already open so far as that part of them is concerned. It is very hard work for the person whose brain is not yet at all opened, as regards the philosophical part of it, to try to understand theosophy. You give him a simple explanation and he probably assimilates only a very few of the broad ideas. The fact is that men need a great deal of preparation. The average man cannot see anything in it. I am not for the moment talking about his being clever or stupid, but simply of the fact that he is not conversant with this line of thought. He requires a good deal of preparation. He gains this for the most part through religion, and in religion he ought to be gradually trained. A fully developed religion ought to be able to meet all classes of people. All religions in the beginning do that, but as time goes on some of them lose one part and some another, and sometimes they crystallize along undesirable lines. 820. If we are to try to understand men, we must remember the extent to which they are developed or undeveloped. We must remember that the mental body is not as yet fully developed, and therefore necessarily the causal body, which is higher, is still less developed, so that it is hardly working at all in the lower classes. Sometimes people who have studied theosophy and have therefore understood a great deal about life and developed their minds along that line, are apt to rest upon their laurels and think that they have done all that is needful in the development of the mind. But often that is not the case, and sooner or later they must undertake some form of intellectual work or mental training. 821. What we should like to study in every man is the working of the soul, yet it is not every one who gives us that opportunity, and in our endeavors to understand we must bear that in mind. On the one hand we must always expect the highest from every man, we must confidently assume that he will do what we feel he ought to do, because the fact of our taking that mental attitude will very much help him to do it. Again and again one sees that if a man who has, perhaps, been mixed up in shady transactions is treated honorably, and shown that honor is expected from him, he will rise to it. On the other hand, if we meet him with suspicion, he will probably soon deserve that suspicion. Yet too much must not be expected from people. We should assume that they are going to do the highest, and should try by our thought to help them to do it, but when they fail we should not be impatient or angry with them. Because evolution is a very slow process and a man can manifest only as much as he has developed. 822. There is never any use in feeling annoyance because someone falls below our standard. We should not blame a man for being what he is, for being at the stage at which he has arrived in evolution. When a person is developed to a high standard and then fails in some way, one may feel, that is a pity, because he knows so much better than that, but there is no reason or use in being annoyed. While we must think the best of our fellow men and must always try to help them to rise to the best that is in them, yet we must take it philosophically if they fail to do that. We must not show annoyance or impatience, but just try to help them where they are. That, I think, is the lesson we are meant to learn when we are told to look into their lives and hearts, and try to understand them. 823. There now comes a long note by the Master Hilarion, which we may take up with advantage bit by bit. He says, 824, from an absolutely impersonal point of view, otherwise your sight is colored. Therefore impersonality must first be understood. 825. We commonly speak of being impersonal when we mean being just or balanced, when we do not bring into our decision anything of our own likes or dislikes, when we act as a judge does on the bench. But the Master means more than that. He holds impersonality to mean the condition in which the personality is for the time entirely transcended, so that not only do we in the personal life regard everything with perfect impartiality, but also we look at things from the point of view of the ego. That is a much more difficult achievement. To do it fully would mean having the causal body fully developed. Humanity at large is still developing the lower mental body. Students of occultism are trying to do something more than that, but as yet there are comparatively few among them who can use the causal body with any kind of certainty. In the beginning the student must therefore reason out for himself what the view of the soul would be, and then follow it, eliminating everything else. 826. It is hard to be impersonal. If there is a dispute between two people, one of whom is a personal friend whom you know very thoroughly, while the other is a stranger, it is scarcely humanly possible to avoid a certain amount of bias in favor of the friend. The reason for that bias is quite a good one. You know more about that person, and the more you know of him the better you come to understand him and the more you will make allowances for him. 827. We can hardly help being a little prejudiced in favor of a friend. I do not think we always realize how very much we are the creatures of circumstances and surroundings. We happen to be born in a certain suburb of a certain big city. We grow up to know a certain small circle, out of that small circle we choose some friends. Presently one may move away and then acquire new friends in other places, but in the beginning the friendships which we form are a question generally of where we happen to be. If we had been born in another suburb, we should probably have had quite a different set of friends. 828. Sometimes people who have been brought together fall in love and marry. They cannot understand that if they had happened to be born somewhere else they would probably have felt just the same to some other person. There is much in propinquity. I know karma comes in, too, in many cases, but these matters are quite often the result of propinquity. We are strongly influenced by our human as well as by our other surroundings. Therefore it is difficult to make this research into the hearts of other men, and finally into our own hearts. 829. We are in the habit of thinking of everything as it happens to affect us. Many people are incapable of taking the wider view, and seeing how it affects the nation as a whole. We have plenty of instances of that in these days when almost everybody has a vote. Quantities of people can think only how the result of the election is likely to affect them personally. They seem incapable of understanding that there is a duty to the community. It is not that they willfully put the thought of themselves before the thought of the community, but that it never occurs to them that there is a wider point of view. 830. There are three ways in which the soul may be developed and may influence our lives, as I have explained before. Point 1, 1 Anti, Volume 2, pages 332-3. Volume IL, page 47. One is that of the great scientists and philosophers of the world, who have developed not only the lower mind, but to a considerable extent the higher as well, so that a great deal of its more abstract kind of thought, its wonderful comprehensive way of thinking, comes down into what they think, although they cannot perhaps express it in their writing. Those who have an attraction for that way, will have to pass through the stage of being the great scientist or philosopher. The Buddhic development will come much later. 831. Secondly, through the higher emotions, such as strong affection, devotion or sympathy, it is possible to awaken the Buddhic principle to a great extent, without developing especially the intermediate causal body, yet not without affecting it. Since all Buddhic development reacts very powerfully on the causal. The method of working of most of our students is to use the higher emotions and work from them upon the Buddhic vesture. I do not mean that they are yet developing a Buddhic vehicle in which they can permanently live. That would be an eminently desirable thing to do, but it is perhaps beyond the reach of most as yet, but the use of the higher emotions unquestionably evokes vibrations in the Buddhic matter. It stirs up the as yet unformed Buddhic vehicle so that many of its vibrations come down and brood over the man's astral body. Thus one may gain a considerable amount of influence from that plane before the vehicle is at all fully developed. 832. There is also another and more obscure path in which the will is called into activity. Just as the astral body reacts on the Buddhic and the lower on the higher mental vehicle, so does the physical somehow react on the nirvanic. I know very little indeed of how it works. But the way of most students is through devotion to the masters and keen sympathy with their fellow men. 833, Intelligence is impartial, no man is your enemy, no man is your friend. All alike are your teachers. Your enemy becomes a mystery that must be solved, even though it take ages, for man must be understood. 834. If you have friends you may indeed be very thankful, but in this particular matter you look on them impersonally, as from above, and say, these are my friends, why have we as souls been thrown together? Then probably you will find that either there are points of great similarity between you, or you are complementary to each other, you go well together in your vibrations and so make a satisfactory whole. 835. In the same way, from this impersonal point of view no man is your enemy. If anyone foolishly puts himself in that position, you say, why should he be doing this? He could not have these feelings towards me unless somewhere in the past I myself had given him cause for it. Let me see if I can discover the cause, and whether there is any way in which his attitude can be changed. 836. Your friend becomes a part of yourself, an extension of yourself, a riddle hard to read. Only one thing is more difficult to know, your own heart. Not until the bonds of personality be loosed can that profound mystery of self begin to be seen. 837. However well one knows a person, even after many years of friendship, one yet sometimes touches a layer of his consciousness which is strange. It has been said, and I think with great truth, that no human being ever perfectly knows another, not even after a long life together. 1 The adept must know. That is one of the great comforts of being associated with the masters. We are so absolutely certain that they know much more about us than we know about ourselves, that they really know us all through. We see in ourselves weaknesses and failings, and we try so far as we can to deal effectively with them. But we may also have other failings that we have not seen, which may come out in great emergencies or moments of strain. It is then a comfort to think that, if there be such things, the Master knows about them, and he will sooner or later bring to the surface anything that we do not know already, and will thus help us to remove it. Those whom he draws nearer to himself in the relation of discipleship at least have this consolation, that they cannot be hopelessly bad, even though well-justified modesty may make them think poorly enough of themselves. 838, 1 Anti, Volume I, Part 5, Ch. 2, Love in Daily Life. 839, At all stages of inner progress the necessary work must be done by us, and with our own will behind it. Even the Master himself cannot do it for us, though he can and does help us by his magnetism, affection and sympathy, as well as by indirect influence which he gives through various pupils of his. He can help us along the way only if we make such karma as allows him to do it. We must make ourselves fit for the opportunity, and then, when it is given, by taking it thoroughly we shall become ready for the next one. 840. Without this the Master has not the right to help, because he also is under the great law of karma, and however willing he may be to lift us straight up to the adept level, he cannot do it. But that we shall receive his invaluable help on the road as soon as we deserve it is very certain, for even he is a friend in the common acceptance of the term. He cannot give us something which we have not earned. He can really help us only when we have become one with him. 841, Not till you stand aside from it, will it in any way reveal itself to your understanding. Then, and not till then, can you grasp and guide it. Then, and not till then, can you use all its powers, and devote them to a worthy service. 842, The Master is clearly thinking here of the higher self, the ego in his causal body, grasping and guiding the lower self. As we have seen before, all of this is to be understood at different levels, according to whether you are dealing with those who are pupils or with the adept himself. For some the task is that the ego in his causal body shall learn to control and direct the personality down here. For others it is that the monad shall take hold of and direct the ego. And when that has been achieved, which is the case of the adept, even then he will still have to take whatever it may be that is next higher to that monad and convert the monad to be a perfect expression of that point. 1. 843, 1 Anti, page 196. 27. 844, 11. Regard most earnestly your own heart. 845, for through your own heart comes the one light which can illuminate life and make it clear to your eyes. 846. Unless you recognize God within yourself you can never find Him outside. Through your own heart comes the one light which can illuminate life and make it clear to your eyes. Its evocation can be very much helped from without. Your Master Himself cannot give you that light, though He can help you to awaken it within yourself. It must come from within, and it is within, whether you know it or not. 847. It surely ought to be a very great blessing and encouragement to us when we find so strongly emphasized in theosophical teaching the fact that the divine is within us and we are essentially part of it. We forget it many times, and allow ourselves to fall away from the consciousness of it, so that temporarily we take short views and are unable to grasp the width and the depth and the glory of His plan. People forget, or perhaps never knew, that they are one with the divine, and that it is only by coming nearer and nearer to the expression of that divinity that they can ever attain real development or happiness. Or indeed any truth which shall put them right with the rest of the world. It has been universally recognized by all mystics that it is only through the God within that we can come into touch truly with the God without. The Master has said in another place, if you cannot see it within yourself then it is useless to look elsewhere. Chapter 5. Rule 13. 848, CWL, at this point in Part 2 of Light on the Path the numbering of the rules undergoes a change. We have no longer sets of 3 aphorisms from the old manuscript, followed by a comment by the Chohan. Rule 13, to which we have now come, is given by the Chohan. 849, 13. Speech comes only with knowledge. Attain to knowledge and you will attain to speech. 850, the Master Hilarian's note on that says. 851. It is impossible to help others till you have obtained some certainty of your own. 852. One may study the theosophical system thoroughly, look at it from all points of view, compare it with other ideas which attempt to account for the state of affairs we see in the world. Come to the definite conclusion that it is very much the best hypothesis before the world, and consequently accept it as true. I suppose one cannot quite call that knowledge, but it is at least a full and reasonable conviction upon which one can act with certainty. 853. If we examine the orthodox Christian statement we see at once that it lacks stability and is inconsistent, though it professes to account for everything it can hardly be said to offer a satisfactory theory. That is why many Christians fear to think. When we come to the theosophical explanation of life, however, we see that we are on firm ground. Suppose someone comes from outside as an inquirer. He may feel that some of our statements are too strong, direct and positive, and may ask, what evidence have you that these things are so? He may doubt the accuracy of some particular statements. But no one could deny, taking the philosophy as a whole, that it is at least a coherent theory, and if it be true it does account for everything. That in many cases is all that can be claimed for scientific theories. We have before us a certain number of facts, the hypothesis has to account for those facts. Here is one which is clearly better than the others, which explains better than the rest all that has been observed. Therefore we accept that as provisionally true. 854. When I came to a knowledge of theosophy I was already a priest of the Anglican Church, yet I doubted a great many of the dogmas put forward by the Church, and always avoided preaching any dogma, but taught morality and illustrated it. Here in theosophy was a reasonable theory, and because it was so reasonable I was very willing indeed to take it. I had then little proof, yet even at that stage I had as much proof for it as we have for a vast number of the facts in astronomy. I had as much evidence for it as we have, for example, for many widely accepted theories in chemistry or physics. Certain experiments are explained by those theories, but there are a good many other things which are not yet explained. 855. Then came for me the further step of meeting Madame Blavatsky, seeing in relation with her certain things which proved some of her contentions. Of course that did not necessarily prove the truth of all the rest, but very soon, within 3 years after coming into the society, I knew of my own knowledge of the existence of the great teachers whom she had described. To find that much true was very good evidence towards the truth of the other statements, especially as they all fitted in so beautifully and made so perfect a system. 856. Later, I became able to investigate for myself many of these questions, and so far as I have yet gone I have found no error in any of the great truths which she laid before us. In her books she gave a vast mass of teaching. As to the meaning of some of it I am not yet in a position to speak from direct knowledge. There are also some statements which I cannot yet understand, but the more I have learnt myself the more I have realized how much she knew. Therefore, while she admitted that there were many mistakes in her books, I have given up looking for them. At first, when we came to anything we did not understand, we thought it was one of the mistakes. Later we found the mistake was with ourselves, we had not fully understood. Errors exist, no doubt, and when we know a great deal more we shall probably come across them. I suspect certain statements of belonging to that class, but am unwilling to assume that they do until I know it to be so. One prefers to take her statements with great respect. 857. Having definite knowledge ourselves, it is true that we can speak with greater conviction. 1 Andy, pages 309-10. I have had that said with regard to myself. People have said that they found my conversation convincing. Others without direct knowledge but far more eloquent than I have put these matters from their point of view, and yet people have said, yes, but do you know it? I have replied, yes, I do, but how do you know I do, although I tell you it is so? We do not know, they would answer, but somehow we feel when a man is speaking of that which he himself knows, and when he is speaking of that which he has merely read and studied. There are all sorts of analogies for the idea that it is impossible to help others till you have obtained some certainty of your own. If you want to lift a person out of stormy waters your own feet must be on the rock. 858. When one soul knows, it conveys its certainty to other souls, and they recognize that certainty. Even though down on the physical plane and with the physical brain they probably could not give any reasons, they feel it when a man really knows. It would be impossible for a man to help others along the line of higher development, or to draw pupils nearer to their masters, unless he knew for himself. 859. This difference is clearly marked in the theosophical manuals, most of which were written by Dr. Bezanт. The first 3, the 7 principles of man, reincarnation and death and after, were written before she could see any of these things, for herself. She very soon recognized that the secret doctrine, wonderful as it is, was most difficult for the average student, and that he would not get out of it 1/10 of what was there unless he could have some preliminary study to prepare for it. So she set to work with her characteristic energy and prepared certain epitomes for her people, simply writing them from her own study of the books, and from answers to questions which she had asked Madame Blavatsky. I doubt whether any other person could have taken the secret doctrine alone and got out of it what she did. She has a wonderful power of welding things together and making them clear. However, by the time she got to the 4th manual, which was karma, she was beginning to see the working of these things for herself. Then I wrote the astral plane and the devachanic plane, and she wrote the 7th manual, man and his bodies. By the time she wrote the last she had fully learnt to see for herself. There is a distinct difference in style in both karma and in man and his bodies. Both those manuals show that she knew what she was talking about at first hand. In the other books she was quoting, and although she wove in the different quotations with wonderful skill, the first 3 manuals contain a great deal which is not quite clear, and is difficult to understand. She has often said she would like to rewrite them, but she is always writing other books, and has never had time. Also she has had the idea that they are historical documents, to show what we knew and what we did not know at that stage. 860. In the early days most of us had a very incomplete idea of the scheme of things, there were many gaps in our theories. Mr. A. P. Sinnott's Esoteric Buddhism was the first effort to make a fairly complete and orderly statement. That book was based entirely upon a vast number of letters which were received by Mr. Sinnott through pupils of the Master Kuthumi. At first we attributed all the answers directly to the master himself, but afterwards we found that they came, if one may put it so, from his office, from his entourage. There was a vast amount of information in the letters, which were largely answers to questions propounded by Mr. Sinnett. It was out of those that Mr. Sinnett's earlier books were written. 861, it is Dr. Bezanт who has done most of the work of tabulating theosophical knowledge for us, who has arranged facts and made them so that he who runs may read. In those earlier days we had to study much harder in order to grasp theosophical truths. But one can see the difference between even her work, splendid as it was, at a time when she was guided only by the books, and when she saw the things for herself. Madame Blavatsky saw many things for herself, but her mind, so far as we could understand it, for it was a very gigantic mind, worked somewhat differently from ours. If one may say it with respect and reverence, it was of an Atlantean type in that it massed together vast accumulations of facts but did not make much effort at arranging them. Swami T. Subha Roy said that the secret doctrine was a heap of precious stones. There is no question that they are precious stones, but one must classify them for oneself. She did not attempt to do that for us, for she did not feel the need of it at all. 862, in the course of my own study I have repeatedly come upon ideas which were quite new to me, and have noted them down, thinking of them not exactly as discoveries, but as ideas that were fresh to me. Perhaps months afterwards, or a year or two later I have looked back at esoteric Buddhism or the secret doctrine, and have found that the idea which I thought to be new was distinctly implied in that book, perhaps not stated in so many words, but certainly implied. Certainly many ideas which we have recently thought to be new ought to have been deduced by us. I can see how those truths follow from the other ideas, and I wonder now how I could have been so stupid as not to have made the deduction. The same experience occurs in quite a striking way at each initiation. The key of knowledge which is then communicated is an absolutely obvious thing. We say to ourselves, well, what have I been doing not to see that myself? But we never do. Nobody does until it is told to him. We need no proof for the statement, it speaks for itself, it is absolutely self-evident. There the fact was, staring us in the face all our life long, and we never saw it. If one ever had any pride in one's intellectual development, it is very soon broken up on this line of experience. 863, only the masters are capable of giving full help to anyone. Their knowledge is universal, and it extends into all higher worlds as well. They appear not to need all the knowledge stored within their brains as we do, but are able to turn a certain faculty on to anything that is wanted and by the use of that faculty, then and there, to know all about it. It might be that there was some information which the master wanted, he would not need to read it up as we should, but he would turn his all-seeing eye on that subject and thereby absorb the knowledge somehow. I think that is what must be meant by getting rid of ignorance. It is obvious that one could never obtain all knowledge along the lines on which we gain knowledge. It is distinctly stated that the last fetter which the Arhat must cast off is avidya, ignorance. 1 Anti, Volume 2, page 364. When we asked, what does that mean? About what must he know, we were told, about everything in the solar system. One shrinks back appalled, because one has some little experience of the lower planes of this world, and one has also established consciousness at various higher levels. I can definitely say that though this is the path along which universal knowledge is gained, yet as one advances one becomes more and more oppressed with the sense of universal ignorance. Every time one rises to higher levels, though one does understand the things one has been trying to understand, one at the same time sees rising up and stretching away in front of one wider and wider fields of which one is ignorant. The more a student gains the more he realizes how very much more there is to learn, and how little, beside that, is all he thinks he has gained. Even that is only half the difficulty, for every additional elevation gives a new point of vision with regard to all the things one already knew, and so one has to learn them all over again from that new point of view. 864. The attempt is not a hopeful one along any line which we have as yet learnt to follow. If we are to have the universal divine knowledge there must be some altogether different way of grasping it, which will open before us as we go further on. I take the whole matter philosophically now, because there is nothing else to be done. I learn all I can along our present lines, and as I gain new methods I use them, but I see I shall never really attain the higher goal along these lines. There must be some entirely new method of acquiring knowledge, and I think we get a little guidance as to what that may be from the Buddhic consciousness of which I have already spoken. In that one no longer has to collect facts from outside, but one plunges into the consciousness of all these things, whether they be minerals or plants or devas, and understands them from inside. Then one finds that it is all a part of one's own consciousness somehow. Along that line it may possibly be worked out. 865. When you have learned the first 21 rules and have entered the hall of learning with your powers developed and sense unchained, then you will find there is a fount within you from which speech will arise. 866. The hall of learning refers in the beginning to the astral world. At a later stage the master probably means something very much higher than that by the same expression. 1. In the first place, when only astral experiences are available to the aspirant, there is a great deal that he can learn in the astral world. It is altogether a new thing for him. New faculties unfold and he finds vistas opening before him in different directions, enabling him to approach everything from that new point of view. To begin with, there is the extra dimension. Besides that, there is the power of seeing through every material thing. Further, the observer translates everything through his emotional vehicle, and that is very different from trying to sense things through a physical body. So there is much to be learnt and to be done in that higher world, because it is there that people most of all need help. It is there that we have all the newly dead in their many different conditions and stages of development, so it is chiefly there that work for those in trouble can be done out of the physical body. 867, 1 Anti, Volume 2, pages 89-91. 868. There comes a later stage when the man becomes free in the mental plane in the same way as most of us are free in the astral when we are away from the physical body. Pupils of the masters are taught especially to develop the mental body until they are able to use it as easily as the astral body. Then they are taught how to make the Mayavirupa, that is to say, a temporary astral body, not the astral body naturally attached to the man, but a temporary materialization on the astral plane which only those can make who have learnt to travel about in their mental vehicles. 11 Anti, Volume 2, pages 121, 274. Volume IL, page 264. 869, the next stage is to learn to use the causal body freely. Then, whatever lower vehicles the man may be using, he retains this new consciousness to some extent. He cannot use the full faculty of the causal body through the astral or the mental, because they form a veil, a limitation, but still he will have the memory of his causal experience with him. If he has also broken through that which acts as a veil between the astral and physical bodies, he will physically remember everything that he does in the higher worlds, so that his existence will be continuous. In the causal body itself his consciousness will be unbroken, not only through sleeping and waking, but through life and death, because that is a permanent consciousness. When a man enters into the next higher hall of learning, the Buddhic plane, he will have direct acquaintance with all that comes before him. He will be able to enter within others, and in another way to draw them inside himself, and so will understand them fully. 870. When a man has his powers developed and his senses unchained at these high levels, he certainly will have a very great deal that he can say. At the same time he will always find himself hampered by a serious difficulty in expression. He sees and knows, and because of that he can say a great deal more than the man who does not know for himself, and can put it very convincingly. And yet with all his effort, and even with all his success as far as certain people are concerned, he will never be free from the consciousness that he is not expressing half of what he has seen. No words will impart to another what has been experienced in a realm beyond words. 871. People who are full of devotion now and then, rise into a condition of ecstasy in which they glimpse the higher planes. When one has once touched that condition he will immediately recognize it in the descriptions attempted by some of the Christian saints, and also by Hindu yogis. Saint Teresa speaks of such experiences, Saint John of the Cross, St. Francis of Assisi and others also mention them once or twice. These Christians reached a condition which they described in Christian terms, whereas a theosophist would describe them in more theosophical terms. He would speak of it in reference to the Masters, they spoke with reference to the Christ. 872. It is a great thing to obtain that touch of the reality behind phenomena, or rather that nearer approach to the reality beyond the forms. Because a fragment of personal experience counts far more than a very great deal of instruction by hearsay. When we have some touch of personal experience we find that there is a fount of speech which arises within us. We feel we have something different to say, something which we must say, which is laid upon us as a charge that we shall give to the world, that we shall bear witness of these splendid realities. The Master says that when you come to know these things for yourself you will find this fount within you from which speech will arise. You will feel that you must and ought to tell the great things which the Lord hath done for you to put it in the Christian form. 873. One does not wish indiscriminately to thrust one's experiences upon people, but one has the feeling that those who have really definite first-hand knowledge of any sort ought always to be willing to bear testimony to it. Those who have personally seen and met and remembered some of the great Masters, should, I think, always be willing to bear witness to that fact, because the outer world is constantly in the attitude of saying, when they hear of such happenings, well, is there anyone who has seen these great beings? I do not wish to degrade the idea of a master by bringing it before those who cannot understand it, but if any such people, even at a public meeting, ask, have you seen any of these great masters? I say in reply, yes I have, but it is not a matter which I care to discuss in a public meeting. It is quite likely that in such a gathering there might be some who would mock at the idea. Even though they said nothing, they might be in a condition of disbelief. While all that makes not the slightest difference to the Masters, it is only fair that we should remember that it does make a great difference to the blasphemer. The man who mocks at great people such as these makes for himself an especially evil form of karma, that I have seen over and over again. So if sometimes it seems that we hold back these things, our real reason for doing so is not only the natural repugnance that we feel toward subjecting names which to us are sacred to the ridicule of the ignorant and the foolish. But it is also out of consideration for the ignorant and foolish themselves, that they may not heap up for themselves very unpleasant experiences in the future. I cannot thoroughly explain that, but I do know that it is so. I have seen it again and again, far too often for it to be a mere coincidence, or the result of any kind of accident. 874. No man has the right to ridicule any religious teacher. He may not believe in him or feel it his duty to follow him, but at least no man of fine feeling would ever ridicule the religious belief of another. The man who does so is doing what is wrong on general principles, irrespective of the nature of the teachings given. 875. It is well, perhaps, that a general caution should be sounded in all directions that one should not adopt a scornful attitude with regard to anything. Because there may always be some fragment of truth even in what seems to us incredible and incomprehensible. Every effect, even a superstition, has a cause, and though in the form in which it now presents itself to us it may be ridiculous, we shall find, if we follow it back, that there was something of truth in it at the beginning. And there is still something behind it. 876. After the 13th rule I can add no more words to what is already written. 877. The Master Hilarion means that the notes made the Venetian Chauhan comprise all that he feels it is safe to say. He then concludes his notes with the words. 878. My peace I give unto you. Increment. 879. These notes are written only for those to whom I give my peace, those who can read what I have written with the inner as well as the outer sense. 880. My peace I give unto you, we saw in Part 1, can only be said by the Master to the disciples who are as himself, or to others who have attained the Buddhic level and are one with him by virtue of attaining that consciousness. 11 Anti, pp. 286-9, 28. 881. Suppose people exchange among themselves a salutation of that sort, peace be with you, and the reply, and on you be peace. What do they give to one another? We may imagine them to stand at the same level, and from each of them goes a strong wish or thought of peace to the other. That would be a real gift, a quite definite material thing. But that happens also whenever one sends out a thought of affection towards somebody one loves. One quite definitely transfers a little part of one's astral body to him as the vehicle of the thought form. One may also transfer higher matter as far as the Buddhic plane if one has developed up to that level. 882. It is well to realize that one is actually giving something material in these cases. Often people do not think that the wish is anything. When they send out a good wish, it is just as material a gift as a book or jewel would be, only it is composed of mental and astral matter. It is a gift the poorest can give as well as the richest. 883. Suppose one receives the blessing of a priest, the peace of God which passeth all understanding be upon you. That again is quite a definite phenomenon. The good wish of the priest which one may receive as well, would be only an infinitesimal fragment of what comes from him. When a priest gives a solemn blessing in the name of God, he is exercising his function as a priest. He is drawing spiritual power from that reservoir which the Christ set apart precisely for that purpose. It is from the very same reservoir which is drawn upon when the Eucharist is celebrated, only this is drawn from a different layer, and gives a different kind of force. There have been great ones who have chosen to found a special section of the reservoir, filled in the first place by themselves, and afterwards kept full by their particular followers. This the Christ himself did in his descent in Palestine. Therefore peace and blessing of a very much higher order than one man can give to another flows over the congregation through the will of the priest. It is not his /own, but comes from that higher source. 884. If one receives the blessing of the bishop, one has a higher stage of the same thing, a fuller outpouring. The bishop, when he gives his blessing as such, makes 3 crosses instead of only the one which the priest makes. He does that to express the threefold force which he sends out. I do not mean to say that being a bishop he would not give that force if he made only 1 cross. But the reason for his making the 3 signs is that he has at his disposal a threefold variety of the same force at a higher level than that given by the priest. If one of our great masters said to a person, "Peace be with you," he would throw upon him a still wider and higher peace. 885. The blessing of the Christ himself is the highest that this earth can give. The Lord of the world truly stands yet above, but it does not come in his way so much to give blessing as to give strength. I think we may say the blessing of the Bodhisattva is the highest of that religious type which this world can give us. How much each one is able to receive of that peace and blessing depends not in the least upon the Bodhisattva, but entirely upon the individual. His power pours forth like the sunshine. Earth-born clouds may get in the way of the sunlight, may obscure the action of that divine force, but it is there nevertheless, a glorious and wonderful power. 886. Most people are in one way much too materialistic and in another not nearly materialistic enough, in their feeling about these higher facts. We have so much materialism clinging about us that unless we can definitely see or at least feel a thing ourselves we can hardly credit its existence. Yet on the other hand we are not material enough in our ideas. People should understand that when we speak of the blessing outpoured by the great ones, even that of the Christ himself, we mean something as definite as electricity or a jet of water. It is through matter that spiritual force manifests itself to us, so when we receive a blessing it is an actual, definite power, which can bring us nearer to the deity. 1. 887, 1 Anti, pages 349-50.